Edmund Rask didn't walk into the Copper Ridge supper house that winter evening looking for trouble. He walked in already owning it. He pulled off his gloves, finger by finger, handed them to nobody in particular, and stood in the doorway long enough that every man in the room looked up. Then he spotted the cowboy in the patched coat, the one standing at the counter counting coins, with his 9-year-old boy pressed against his side, and Edmund Rask smiled the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Boys," he said, loud enough to carry, "looks like somebody forgot to tell this one that the cattle season's over and the begging season hasn't started yet." The room laughed, not all of it, but enough. If this story already has your attention, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what happens next, because these stories have a way of going places nobody expects. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The cold came in off the mountains that December like something personal. Harlan Vey felt it through the seams of his coat, which had been repaired twice already with thread that didn't quite match, and he'd stopped caring about that somewhere around October. What he cared about right now was the coins in his palm. He'd counted them twice walking from the livery, and he was counting them a third time standing at the wooden counter of Jessup's supper house. Because 3 times was apparently what it took before a man's brain would finally accept an answer it didn't want. 51 cents. A full supper for one was 60 cents. A full supper for 2 was $1.10. Behind him, Owen stood without making a sound. That was the thing about Owen that Harlan could never quite decide whether it worried him or broke his heart the boy had stopped asking for things. Not because he was sulking, but because sometime in the past 2 years, he had quietly understood that asking for things cost his father something, and Owen, at 9 years old, had decided he wasn't willing to keep paying that price on someone else's behalf. Harlan turned to look at him. Owen was staring at a table across the room where a man in a wool vest was cutting into a thick slice of beef with the slow, satisfying certainty of someone who had never once worried about how it got there. Steam rose from the plate. The bread beside it was fresh. Harlan could smell it from where he stood. Owen looked away from the table the moment he realized his father was watching him. "I'm not that hungry," Owen said. He was absolutely hungry. "Give me a minute," Harlan told him. The man behind the counter was named Greer, and he'd run Jessup's for 11 years and had learned to read a man's situation without being asked. He kept his expression neutral, while Harlan leaned toward him and said quietly, "I've got 51 cents. I could cover the difference by chopping wood I saw. You've got a cord outside that hasn't been split yet. I'd have it done before you close." Greer opened his mouth. He didn't get to say anything. "Split wood." The voice came from a table to the left, loud and amused. Did that man just offer to split wood for his supper? Harlan turned. 3 men were seated at the long table near the window, the kind of table that got the best light and the fastest service, which meant they'd arranged things that way before they ever sat down. The man who'd spoken was Edmund Rask, though Harlan didn't know his name yet. He was somewhere past 50, broad through the shoulders, with a cattleman's tan line from years of wearing the same hat in the same sun. He was dressed well, not showy, just expensive in the quiet way that people are when they've never had to think about the cost. Beside Rask sat 2 younger men. One was thin and watchful, with the look of someone who'd learned to wait for permission before laughing. The other was already grinning. "It's not a bad offer," the grinning one said. No, Edmund said, settling back. "It's a fine offer. Very industrious." He looked at Harlan directly. "Tell me, friend, what kind of cowboy can't feed his own boy by December? Did you lose the cattle or just lose count of them?" Harlan said nothing. That was usually the right answer. He'd learned it was almost always the right answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because men like this one fed on response the way fire feeds on air, and starving them was the only reliable method. But the grinning one wasn't finished. "Nice coat," he said. "What happened? Did the other half of it go to the horse?" The thin one laughed at that, short and sharp, then went quiet again. Owen had moved slightly closer to Harlan's arm. "We'll take 2 bowls of whatever's cheapest," Harlan told Greer, keeping his voice even. "I'll make up the difference in the morning if you'll trust me overnight." Greer was already nodding. Harlan could see it. Could see the man wanted to just say yes, and have it done when Edmund Rask spoke again. "Don't embarrass yourself, Greer. You let every drifter with a sob story eat on credit. You'll go broke by spring." He tilted his glass slightly, not even a gesture, just a shift of attention. "This one will be gone by morning anyway." They always are. The room had gotten quieter. Not completely silent, because these things never went fully silent. There was still the scrape of forks and the low murmur of the far tables. But in the immediate area, people were watching, without looking like they were watching. Harlan felt the familiar pull in his chest, not anger exactly. Or not only anger. It was the specific, suffocating weight of being seen as nothing by someone who had decided that before they ever looked at you. He put his hand on Owen's shoulder. "Come on," he said. Owen didn't argue. He was 9 and he was smart and he understood what had just happened, even if he couldn't name all the pieces of it. They were 3 steps toward the door when the chair scraped. Not Edmund Rask's chair. A chair from the corner from the table. Harlan had half noticed when they walked in, the one with good linens and a single candle instead of the common tallow. The one where a woman had been sitting with a cup of something warm. Eating supper alone in a way that suggested she'd chosen to eat alone rather than been forced to. She stood. Harlan heard her cross the room before he turned. She walked with a purpose that didn't announce itself, no hurry, no performance. Just a woman who'd decided on a direction and was now moving in it. 31 years old, though Harlan wouldn't have guessed precisely. Dark hair pinned back in the practical way of women who spent most of their time outdoors and had stopped pretending otherwise. A wool dress that was fine but not fragile. Her face was the kind that caught attention not by being particularly soft, but by being absolutely awake, like she was always calculating something, quietly, behind whatever expression she was wearing at the moment. She stopped directly in front of Harlan and Owen. Then she turned and looked at Edmund Rask. "That's enough, Edmund," she said. Not loudly. She didn't raise her voice. She said it the way you'd say it to someone whose behavior you found tiresome rather than threatening, which was, Harlan would later understand, precisely the right thing to make Edmund Rask feel. Rask looked at her. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite something else. "Lenora, I heard what you were just doing." She turned back to Harlan. "Sit down." "Not charity," she said before he could finish. "Work. Sit down and I'll explain." Harlan looked at her for a moment. He was tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night. He was tired in the way that men get tired when they've been trying to hold something together by themselves for too long, and the thing keeps slipping anyway. And you begin to wonder at what point the effort itself is the pride talking rather than the sense. He looked at Owen. Owen was looking at the steaming plates on the nearest table. "All right," Harlan said. They sat at her table, Lenora Ashbourne's table, though Harlan didn't know her name yet either, and she ordered 3 full suppers without making a scene of it, and Owen ate with the controlled restraint of a child who was desperately hungry, but had learned that eating too fast in front of strangers was something his father would feel bad about later. "Owen," Harlan said quietly. "I'm eating slow," Owen said. Harlan looked at the boy's plate. He was eating moderately fast. "Slower," Harlan said. Lenora watched this exchange and said nothing. She drank her coffee and waited. When the edge came off Owen's hunger enough that the boy leaned back slightly, she set her cup down. "You identified the problem with the gray outside," she said to Harlan. Harlan frowned. The gray, the horse tied at the post beside the livery. The one with the favor on her left hind. He'd stopped for maybe 40 seconds outside the livery. He hadn't thought anyone was watching. "Coffin bone," he said. "The way she's standing puts most of the weight on the toe. She needs the heel built up before she does more damage to herself. The man who owns her thinks she's just cold. She's not just cold. I know she's not just cold." Lenora set her spoon across her plate. "My name is Lenora Ashbourne. I own Silver Briar Ranch, 15 miles north. You've heard of it, or you haven't. It doesn't matter. What matters is that my foreman died 6 weeks ago, and I am going into winter with 43 horses, 11 ranch hands who each think they know more than the others, and nobody with the judgment to run the operation as a single coherent thing." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "You want a foreman. I want someone who understands horses the way you apparently do, from 40 seconds of standing near one. I was a trail hand for 12 years. Before that, my father ran a small breeding operation in Wyoming. Is your father still running it? No. What happened? Drought. Then debt. Then he died." Harlan said it without bitterness, just sequence. Those things happen in that order fairly often. Lenora looked at him steadily. "What happened to your wife?" Across the table, Owen went still. Harlan kept his eyes on Lenora. "Fever, 2 years ago February. So it's been you and the boy since then?" "Yes." "And you're in Copper Ridge because?" "We were working a ranch southeast of here. Owner stopped paying wages in September. Said the losses from the cattle sickness made it impossible. We stayed through October hoping it would get better. Harlan paused. It didn't get better. So you left. We left. Lenora nodded once like she was adding figures in her head. I'll offer you a foreman's wage, $40 a month, plus room in the foreman's cottage for you and the boy. It's small, but it's solid. You'd start immediately. That means tonight if you're willing, because I need to get back before the road ice is over. Owen looked at his father with the very careful expression of a child who has learned not to show how much he wants something. Harlan said, "Why me? You don't know me. I know you looked at that horse instead of walking past it. I know you didn't yell at your son for eating fast when he was hungry and had every reason to. And I know you were willing to chop wood rather than beg." She picked up her coffee again. Edmund Rask has 40 years of land and money and connections in this territory, and he used all of it to make a hungry man feel small. You've got 51 cents, and you're still sitting up straight. That tells me something. Harlan was silent. Then quietly, how do you know I had 51 cents? I watched you count it twice before you went to the counter. At the far table, Edmund Rask was no longer looking at them. He was talking to his companions with the elaborate casualness of a man who wants to appear uninterested in something he is absolutely still thinking about. I've got a horse, Harlan said, old, slow. She'll need feed. She'll have it. And the boy needs schooling. There's a school 3 miles from the ranch. I already spoke to the schoolmaster 3 months ago. I was hoping to find someone by November, and I ran out of time. She said it plainly, without apology. I'm behind on several things. Owen said, Pa, I heard you, Harlan said, without looking at him. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. Owen went quiet. Harlan turned the idea over in his head, the way he turned most things over, looking for the side of it that would break first, the place where the trouble was hiding. A wealthy widow offering a drifter a foreman's position within 10 minutes of meeting him. There were things that could mean. Most of them he didn't want to think about in front of his son. As if she'd read this, Lenora said, I understand how it looks. A woman alone making a quick offer to a man with no leverage. I'm not unaware of how that could be read. She met his eyes directly. I have 8 ranch hands who've worked for me more than 3 years. I have a county sheriff who eats supper at Silver Briar twice a month and has for 4 years. And I have a reputation in this territory that I have spent 10 years building and would not risk for foolishness. She paused. You'll have your own cottage with a lock on the door and complete control of your own situation. What I need from you is competence. That's all. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Owen. Owen was looking at his plate, but he'd eaten most of the bread already, and his shoulders had lost the particular set they carried when he was bracing for disappointment. All right, Harlan said again. They left Copper Ridge an hour later. Harlan's old mare, whose name was Biscuit, a name Owen had given her 3 years ago, and Harlan had never managed to stop using tied to the back of Lenora's wagon, with enough slack to walk comfortably. Owen sat in the wagon bed, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like cedar, and something Harlan didn't recognize, watching the town lights shrink behind them. Harlan sat on the bench beside Lenora, and neither of them talked for the first mile, because the cold made breath feel expensive. Then Owen said, from behind them, What happened to your husband, ma'am? Harlan closed his eyes briefly. Owen, it's fine, Lenora said. She kept her eyes on the road. He died 4 years ago. Horse accident. Was it the horse's fault? Owen, Harlan said. It's a fair question, Lenora said. No, it wasn't the horse's fault. He went out in weather that was too bad to ride in, on a trail he hadn't used in a while, and the horse spooked at something in the dark, and he came off wrong. She paused. It was his fault, mostly, though I don't say that unkindly. Owen considered this. My ma died from fever, he offered, as if in exchange. I know, your father told me. Pa doesn't talk about it much. Some things are hard to talk about. Does it get easier? Owen asked. Talking about it? The wagon wheel found a rut, and Lenora navigated around it before answering. Easier isn't quite the word I'd use. It gets different. One day you notice you can say the words without them hitting you the same way. That's not the same as easier, but it's something. Owen was quiet for a bit. Then I can say the words. I know you can. I'm 9. I know. Pa says I'm old for 9. I believe it, Lenora said. Harlan stared straight ahead at the road and said nothing. The cold settled in around them, and the horse's breath made small clouds in the dark air, and somewhere to the north, Silver Briar was waiting like a problem that didn't know yet it was about to have a solution. Silver Briar Ranch came into view after 40 minutes of road that worsened gradually, the way bad things often did, slowly enough that you kept thinking it would improve just around the next bend. It was bigger than Harlan had expected. Not just the house, which was substantial and dark at this hour, with only 2 windows lit, but the spread of it, the fencing, the outbuildings, the long shape of the main stable against the sky. He could hear horses even from this distance, that particular low sound of animals settling for the night. The ranch hand who met them at the gate was named Cal, and he was somewhere past 40 with hands that hadn't been warm since October, and the look of a man who'd been waiting longer than he'd intended. "Mrs. Ashbourne," he said, taking the reins. "Cal, this is Harlan Vey. He'll be taking the foreman position. He and his boy are in the cottage tonight." Cal looked at Harlan the way ranch hands looked at new foremen, which was to say, with the expression of a man who has been managing without a foreman for 6 weeks and has complicated feelings about someone arriving to manage him. "Evening," Harlan said. "Evening," Cal said, not unfriendly. Not friendly either. That was fine. Harlan hadn't expected friendly. He'd worked enough ranches to know that being liked and being respected were 2 different things earned on 2 different timelines. And confusing them was how foremen got things wrong in the first months. The cottage was small, 1 main room with a wood stove, a sleeping loft above, a table that listed slightly to one side, and a door that closed all the way if you lifted it slightly while pulling. The lock worked. The wood stove worked. Outside, someone had stacked a reasonable cord of wood against the wall. Owen went up the ladder to the loft and was asleep in minutes. Harlan sat at the listing table with a candle and a piece of paper. Lenora had left a rough accounting of the ranch's situation. 43 horses. 7 in the secondary stable with various issues. The winter feed situation was workable but tight. 2 ranch hands whose contracts were up in January and whose intentions were unclear. And a note at the bottom in Lenora's handwriting, tight and practical. "Neighbors will talk. Let them. Results are the only answer that matters in the long run." He folded the paper. Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere in the main stable a horse shifted its weight and knocked against a board with the rhythmic patience of an animal that had learned to wait. Harlan thought about Edmund Rask's face in the supper house, the lazy certainty of it. The way the laughter had come without hesitation, like laughing at a man counting his coins in front of his son, was simply the natural response, the appropriate thing, the thing a man of status did when confronted with a man without it. He didn't feel angry anymore. He'd gone past angry somewhere on the wagon road. What he felt now was something colder and more useful. He blew out the candle and went to bed. The first 2 weeks at Silver Briar were the kind that didn't announce themselves as important. Harlan woke before the hands each morning and walked the stables before anyone else was moving, which was partly habit and partly deliberate. He needed to understand the horses before he could understand anything else, and he needed to understand them without other people's interpretations filtering his view. What he found was complicated. 3 horses in the secondary stable were being treated for respiratory problems, with a remedy that wasn't wrong, exactly, but wasn't addressing the underlying issue, which was ventilation. The secondary stable's airflow had been partially blocked by a feed bin repositioned at some point in the fall, and the animals were breathing stale, damp air for hours each night. He moved the bin the first morning without telling anyone, and by the 4th day 2 of the 3 horses were noticeably improved. Cal noticed. He didn't say anything, but Harlan caught him examining the repositioned bin on the 3rd morning, and Cal had the look of a man recalibrating. The hands were sorting themselves out, the way hands always did, the ones who worked and the ones who performed working. Harlan identified them in the first week without making it obvious he was looking. There was a young one named Fletcher who moved fast but made more noise than progress. There was an older one named Dix who moved slow but finished everything he started and had to be reminded of nothing twice. There was Cal, who fell somewhere in between, and whose opinion of the other hands Harlan was still mapping. He started assigning tasks in ways that played to what people were actually good at, which required him to first notice what that was, which required him to watch without appearing to watch. This was something he'd always been moderately good at. Lenora, he noticed, was extremely good at it. She was also in the stable most mornings, not managing, observing. She'd stand at the end of a row of stalls with a cup of something hot and watch the horses, with the focused quiet of someone who wasn't going to speak until she had something worth saying. Twice in the first week, Harlan had turned from a stall to find her standing nearby, not having announced herself, Not doing anything in particular except being present. You don't sleep much, he said on the fourth morning. I sleep enough, she said. I just start early. There's a horse in stall 7 that's been off her feed for 3 days. The hands think she's just being difficult. She's not difficult. She's anxious. I know. She needs to be moved away from the stallion 2 stalls down. They've got some kind of history that's making her tense. Lenora looked at him. How do you know they have a history? She watches the wall between the stalls constantly. Won't look away when he moves. That's not general anxiety that's specific. Something happened between those two, either at this ranch or wherever they were before. Lenora was quiet for a moment. She came from the Rask operation 3 years ago. Rask was selling off horses he considered underperforming. The stallion came from the same sale. Harlan thought about this. What happened between them at Rask's? I don't know. Whatever it was, she hasn't forgotten it. No, Lenora said. She hasn't. He moved the mare that afternoon to a stall on the opposite end of the stable, near a quiet gelding who had the temperament of a piece of furniture. By the next morning, she was eating steadily again. Lenora saw it. She didn't say anything about it directly. But when Harlan passed her near the tack room that afternoon, she said, without preamble, good call on the mare. She just needed somewhere she could relax. Most things do, Lenora said, and walked past him. Owen was in school by the end of the first week. The schoolmaster was a young man named Pruitt, who was perhaps 25, and had the enthusiastic certainty of someone not yet old enough to know what they didn't know. Owen came back from the first day with the reserved expression he wore when processing something he hadn't decided about yet. How was it? Harlan asked. There are 14 other kids. And they asked me a lot of questions about where I came from. What did you tell them? I said we'd been moving around. That's accurate. And then Pruitt asked me to read something out loud, and I read it, and he said I was the best reader he'd seen in that school in 2 years. Harlan kept his expression neutral, did he? Yeah. Owen paused. Is that true, do you think? Or is he just saying it? Read something to me. Owen grabbed the single book they owned, a battered almanac from 1882, and read 2 pages without stopping, without stumbling, with appropriate emphasis in the right places. It's probably true, Harlan said. Owen considered this. Then, I think I like school. Good. Don't make a big thing of it. I'm not making a thing of it. You're making a face. I'm not making a face. Owen squinted at him. You're making the face you make when you're trying not to make a face. Go wash up for supper, Harlan said. It was during the 3rd week that Harlan first noticed something wrong with the feed. It wasn't dramatic. There was no obvious sign, no sudden collapse, nothing that announced itself as the beginning of something. It was just a quality, in the way 3 horses in the eastern stable were carrying themselves, that nagged at him. The way things nag when your brain has identified a pattern your conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. Slightly dull coats, marginally reduced energy, not sick, not injured, not obviously anything. He started paying attention to what they were eating. The eastern stable's winter feed had come from a different supplier than the main stable. Lenora had explained this when he arrived. The main feed contract had been locked in before the foreman died. The eastern stables had been arranged separately, through a local merchant named Garland, who provided a slightly cheaper rate. Harlan took a handful of the eastern feed and examined it. Then he took it to the main stable and compared it. He couldn't identify precisely what was different. He wasn't a chemist. But the texture was off in a way he'd seen before, years ago, at a ranch in Colorado, where someone had been cutting grain with a cheaper filler, not enough to cause immediate visible harm, but enough to affect nutritional quality over weeks. He brought the comparison to Lenora that evening. She examined both samples carefully, in the good light of her front room, without saying anything for almost a minute. You're sure about this? She said. No, I'm not sure of anything. I'm telling you what I see and what it reminds me of. When do you want to pull them off the eastern feed? Already done, Harlan said. As of this afternoon, all horses are on the main supply. Lenora looked up from the grain samples. You already did it. Stopping the possible harm seemed more important than waiting to discuss it. She held his gaze for a moment, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then you should have told me first. Yes, he said. I should have. I'll do that next time. I'm not angry. I know. I'm saying it as a thing to know, not as a... I understand, Harlan said. I moved fast. I'll keep you in the loop. She nodded. I'll write to Garland tomorrow. Don't mention the feed quality specifically. Just say you've changed your supply arrangements. She looked at him. Why? Because if it's deliberate and you mention the quality, whoever arranged it will know they need to be more careful next time. He paused. I'm probably wrong. It's probably nothing. But if it's not nothing, then they don't need to know we noticed. Lenora set the grain samples on the table very carefully. All right, she said. We'll do it your way. The horses who'd been on the eastern feed improved within a week. Not dramatically, no sudden transformation. Just the gradual return of an appropriate brightness in their eyes, a restored energy in the way they moved, the kind of change that took longer to see than to cause. But on a cold morning in the second week of January, Harlan was in the main stable, laying down fresh bedding in the far stalls, when Cal appeared in the doorway and said, simply, "We've got a problem." 2 horses in the south section of the main stable were off their feed. 3 hours later, it was 4 horses. By evening, it was 7. And this time, Harlan recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't a quality issue. This wasn't a slow accumulation of nutritional deficit. The animals were in actual distress-elevated temperatures, erratic behavior, one mare pressing her head against the stall wall with the confused, desperate movement of an animal that cannot locate the source of its pain. Harlan moved through the stalls quickly, checking each one, his jaw set, and his mind running through everything he knew about feed contamination and disease transmission and the specific sequence in which Silver Briar's horses had shown symptoms. The pattern was wrong for disease. Disease spread from animal to animal in a path that followed contact and proximity. What he was seeing didn't follow that path, it jumped. 1 stall, then 3 stalls over, then back. Not random, but not biological spread either. Contaminated feed again. But this time the main supply. Someone had gotten to the main supply. He found Lenora in the house at her desk and said, without sitting down, "Someone is doing this intentionally." She looked up from her papers. He told her what he'd found. The pattern of affected animals, the distribution that didn't make sense for disease, his assessment of what it meant. She was very still while he talked. When he finished, she said, "You're telling me someone came onto this ranch and contaminated the feed. I'm telling you, that's what the evidence looks like. During the night, without anyone seeing them. The main feed room doesn't lock. I noticed that the first week I meant to bring it up." Harlan. "I know. Who?" He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know. I have a thought, but it's a guess and I don't want to say it yet. Tell me your guess. After we deal with the horses." She stood up from the desk. They spent the next 6 hours in the stable together, Lenora and Harlan and Cal and Dix and Fletcher, replacing contaminated bedding, isolating affected animals, bringing in emergency feed from a neighbor 2 miles down the road whom Lenora called in a favor from without explaining why. The temperature outside dropped to 8 degrees above zero, and the stable's internal warmth was barely enough, and everyone's hands were numb by midnight, and there was a moment around 2 in the morning when Harlan was kneeling beside the mare with the wall-pressing behavior, and her temperature had come down half a degree, and he thought, "She's going to be all right." She was going to be all right. He stayed with her another hour to be certain. When he finally stood, his knees were stiff, and his back ached in the specific way it ached when he'd been crouching too long in the cold, and Lenora was standing behind him with 2 cups of coffee, one of which she handed him without a word. They stood in the stall doorway and drank it. "Your guess," she said. "Edmund Rask." Lenora was quiet. "He's been trying to buy this land for years," Harlan said. "You've turned him down. If the ranch looks financially vulnerable going into spring, if you've had significant losses, horses down, production disrupted, the land loses value and your position weakens. He's done business in this territory for decades," she said. "He wouldn't risk his reputation. He wouldn't risk it himself. But he'd pay someone who has less to lose. Do you have any evidence?" "Not yet." "Then it's a guess," Harlan said. "It's a guess." The mare shifted behind him and pressed her nose against his shoulder, and he reached back without looking and put his palm flat against her face, and she breathed out slowly, and the steam rose in the cold air between them. "Get some sleep," Lenora said. "I'll stay a bit longer." "Harlan." "An hour," he said. "Just to be sure." She left him there with the horses and the cold and the coffee that was going lukewarm in his hands, and outside the wind had picked up again, and somewhere across the dark land, Edmund Rask was sleeping in his comfortable house, not knowing that the penniless cowboy he'd laughed at in the supper house was starting to understand exactly what game was being played, and was starting to think about how to play it differently. He stayed with that mare longer than an hour. He knew it when the candle stub in the wall sconce burned down to nothing, and the stable went dark, except for the thin cold light coming through the gaps in the boards. And he was still sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner of the stall with his back against the wall, and his knees drawn up, and the mare standing over him like she was the one keeping watch, instead of the other way around. At some point he slept, not well, not for long. The kind of sleep that happens to a body without asking permission, 20 minutes maybe, and then he was awake again, with a stiff neck and numb feet, and the immediate instinctive awareness of where he was and why. He checked the mare. Her temperature was down another half degree. She was standing squarely on all 4 feet, which she hadn't been doing at midnight. He put his hand on her neck and felt the warmth of her, the slow, steady pulse of a body working the way it was supposed to work, and the knot in his chest that had been there since Cal appeared in the stable doorway. With the words, "We've got a problem," loosened by a fraction. Outside, the sky was the particular dark blue that happened about an hour before actual dawn. Not light yet, but no longer full dark either. He stood up carefully, both hands braced on his knees, and the joints complained the way joints do after 40, and a cold night on a bucket. He checked the other 6 affected horses in sequence. All of them improved, none of them backsliding, and then he walked to the feed room and stood in the doorway and looked at it. The room was about 12 by 14 feet, with wooden shelves along 2 walls and bins on the floor for loose grain. A single window, too small for a grown man to climb through easily but not impossibly. The door had a latch, the kind that functioned perfectly well as a door latch and not at all as a security measure. He stood there for a while just looking at it. Then he went to find Cal. Cal was already in the smaller tack room off the east stable, doing something with a length of harness leather that needed resolving before it could be used again. He looked up when Harlan came in and read something in Harlan's face that made him put the harness down. "How are they?" Cal said. "Better. All 7. The mare's temperature came down overnight." "Good." Cal picked up the harness again, then put it back down. "You sleep at all?" "Some, on the bucket. It was fine. That bucket's been in this stable for 6 years. It's got a crack in the bottom and 1 handle." "I know. I noticed the crack around 2 in the morning." Cal looked at him for a moment with the expression he used when he was deciding whether to say something or not. He'd been doing that since Harlan arrived, running this private calculation, this ongoing assessment of whether Harlan had earned the next increment of information, or trust, or plain human acknowledgement. It didn't bother Harlan particularly. He'd worked with enough men like Cal to understand that this was not hostility, but a specific kind of integrity, the refusal to extend something that hadn't been warranted yet. "The feed room," Harlan said. "How often does someone check it?" "Night, I mean." Cal was still. "Nobody checks it at night. Never been a reason to." "When was the last time anyone was in there before last evening?" Cal thought about it. "Morning before. Fletcher went in for the afternoon feed. So between morning and evening, anyone could have come in." The gate to the south yard was open when I came through at 11 last night," Harlan said. "I closed it, but it'd been sitting open." Cal's jaw tightened. Fletcher was supposed to close it after the afternoon rounds. "I'm not interested in Fletcher right now. I'm interested in the gate." Harlan leaned against the doorframe. Who else knows the layout of this ranch well enough to move through it at night without getting lost or making noise? Cal looked at him with the full force of a man who has just understood a question that went considerably further than he was expecting. "You think someone came in deliberate?" "I think it's possible. To poison the feed. To contaminate it. Probably not to kill the horses. Dead horses would be obvious. Sick horses that recover but cost money and time and create doubt about the ranch's management. That's more useful to a certain kind of person." Cal was quiet for a long time. "I've worked this ranch 8 years, he said finally. "I know. Mrs. Ashbourne built this place from half of nothing after her husband died. She did it herself, mostly. Before she had the money to hire on a full crew, it was her and 2 hands and whatever family came through looking for seasonal work." "I know," Harlan said more quietly. "If someone is deliberately..." Cal stopped. Started again. "You tell her yet?" "Last night, she knows." "What did she say?" "She listened. Then she helped with the horses." Harlan pushed off the doorframe. "I need a lock for the feed room. And I need the south gate latched every night with something that can't swing open in wind. Can you handle that today without making a production of it?" Cal looked at him steadily. "I can handle it. And I need to know if anyone comes onto this property that you don't recognize or weren't expecting. Doesn't matter how casual it looks. A rider asking directions, Someone claiming to be from a supply or anything. You think they'll come back. If the goal is to financially pressure this ranch going into spring, then one contamination event that the horses recover from isn't enough. They'll need to try again. Cal picked up the harness leather and held it in both hands and stared at it without seeing it. Then he said, "There's a man named Briggs. Rides for Rask. Been seen on the Copper Ridge Road 2-3 times in the last month. Thought nothing of it." Harlan kept his voice even. "What does Briggs look like?" "Thin, light hair. Rides a bay with a split ear. If you see him near this property again," Harlan said, "I want to know about it before you do anything else. Before you say anything to anyone else, just come to me." Cal nodded once. "Lock on the feed room today," Harlan said. "I'll tell Mrs. Ashbourne." He left Cal with the harness and walked out into the blue-going gray morning, and the cold hit him in the face the way cold does when you've been in a barn long enough to half forge it. It's winter outside. And he stood for a moment, with his breath clouding in front of him, and looked across the dark land toward the ridge where, on a clear day, you could see the roofline of Rask's main house. You couldn't see it now, too dark, too far, but it was there. Owen came down from the loft at 6:30, as he always did, with his boots already on. He'd learned in the past year, of moving around, that a person who sleeps with their boots nearby is a person who can leave quickly if leaving quickly becomes necessary, and this habit had stayed with him, even now that leaving quickly wasn't the immediate concern it used to be. He found his father at the table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper covered in handwriting, and he read his father's face the way he'd learned to read it, which was to say not by looking at it directly, but by reading the set of his shoulders and the way he was holding his cup. "Something happened," Owen said. "Some horses got sick last night. They're better now." Owen sat down across from him. "You were in the stable all night. Most of it. You should sleep." "I will. You always say that." "And I always do eventually." Owen pulled the bread toward him and broke off a piece. He chewed it and looked at the paper his father was writing on. "Is it bad? The horses? They'll recover. Is it going to be a problem for the ranch?" Harlan looked at him across the table. "Why would you ask that?" Owen shrugged in the way that meant he'd heard or noticed something he wasn't sure he was supposed to mention. "I heard Cal talking to Dix last night when I went to get water. They didn't know I was there. Cal said something about weather misses. Ashbourne could hold the ranch if things went wrong this winter." Harlan was quiet. "Is that what this is?" Owen said. "Are we going to have to leave again?" "No." "Pa." "We're not leaving," Harlan said. "I'm not going to let that happen." Owen looked at him for a moment with that 9-year-old directness that still occasionally stopped Harlan mid-breath. "You can't always stop things from happening," Owen said. "Sometimes things just happen." "I know that. You couldn't stop Mama getting sick." "Owen, I'm just saying." Owen looked back at his bread. "You always talk like you can fix everything if you just work hard enough. Sometimes you can't." Harlan didn't answer right away. He'd thought, more than once in the past 2 years, that Owen understood too much for 9. That the past 2 years had compacted something in the boy, accelerated him past certain stages of childhood innocence that he should have had more time to occupy. Harlan felt responsible for that, which was probably half reasonable and half the reflexive guilt of a parent who'd been unable to prevent hard things. "You're right," Harlan said. "Sometimes you can't fix everything." Owen looked up, slightly surprised by this answer. "But this one," Harlan said, "I think I can fix. I just need some time." Owen considered this with the seriousness he gave most things. Then he said okay, and finished his bread, and went to get his coat for school. Lenora Ashbourne had not slept particularly well either, though she wouldn't have said so to anyone. She was at her desk by 5:30 with the ranch accounts open in front of her, which was where she went when she needed to think about something other than what she was actually thinking about. The numbers were not alarming. Silver Briar was in reasonable shape. The fall sales had covered the major winter expenses, and her breeding contracts for the spring were solid. But reasonable shape was a specific distance from comfortable, and the difference mattered when you are calculating how much disruption you could absorb before disruption became crisis. 7 horses sick, all recovering, which was the best possible outcome. But 7 horses out of rotation for even 2 weeks in the winter training schedule meant delays in the spring preparations, which meant potential renegotiation with buyers who had timelines of their own. She wrote down numbers she already knew. It helped her think. When Harlan knocked at 7, she called him in without getting up. He came in with mud on his boots from the stable yard, The freeze-thaw at this hour made the ground soft in specific patches, and he stood in front of her desk with the careful posture of a man who is tired enough to want to sit down and too aware of the social geometry to do it without being asked. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "How are they?" "All 7 are improving. The mare I was worried about came down another degree overnight. She'll be fine." He paused. "Cal is putting a lock on the feed room today." "Good. And I want to talk about the gate on the south yard." "What about it? It was open last night at 11. It should have been closed at evening rounds. I want a different latch, something that can't swing open in wind." Lenora set her pen down. "You think they'll try again?" "If the goal is to create financial pressure on the ranch, one contamination event isn't enough. It's an inconvenience, not a crisis. They'd need repeated incidents or one large one." He looked at her steadily. "I think we should assume they'll try again and prepare for it." She was quiet for a moment. "Cal mentioned a man named Briggs to me this morning." "He mentioned him to me too. Briggs has worked for Rask for 6 years. He's a competent enough writer, not particularly principled, which makes him useful for certain kinds of tasks." She picked up her pen and set it down again. "If Rask is involved, I know it's still a guess." "Not entirely." She opened the middle drawer of her desk and took out a folded paper. "I received this 3 days ago. I wasn't sure what to make of it." Harlan took it. It was a short letter, formally worded, from Edmund Rask's lawyer. It expressed concern about the viability of Silver Briar's winter operations, given the recent loss of its foreman, offered Rask's sympathy for the difficulty, and almost as an afterthought. In the final paragraph mentioned that Rask remained interested in discussing a possible purchase of the Silver Briar property should Lenora find herself in a position where selling made sense. It was dated 10 days ago, before the feed contamination, before the sick horses. He anticipated trouble, Harlan said, or caused it, then sent this to establish that he'd been sympathetic and businesslike before the trouble became visible. Lenora took the letter back. Edmund Rask did not build what he has by being careless. If he's involved in this, he'll have layers between himself and anything provable. Then we can't go after him directly, no. And if we go to the territorial authorities now, we have a letter that's technically just a business inquiry, and a feed contamination we can't trace back to anyone. Correct. Harlan was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his mind. Lenora watched him do it. She'd noticed this about him in the first week, the way he went internally still when he was working through a problem, like a dog pointing. It was not an unpleasant quality. He expects you to respond to pressure by becoming uncertain, Harlan said. Everything he's done is built on that assumption. The letter, the feed, whichever ranch hand he's paying, it's all designed to make Silver Briar look unstable and make you feel like you can't hold it. I know that. So what if the ranch doesn't look unstable? Lenora frowned slightly. What do you mean? The sick horses recover faster than expected. The spring preparations stay on track. The breeding contracts hold. And you say nothing to anyone about contaminated feed or Rask's letter. He paused. If Rask's intelligence about this ranch is coming from someone nearby, someone watching, maybe someone on the property, then what they report back matters. Let them report that Silver Briar weathered the winter without difficulty, while we quietly work to find out what he actually did and how. Yes. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. You've thought about this before. I grew up around men who had less than other men, Harlan said. You learn that a direct fight against someone with more resources is usually a losing proposition. You have to make them come to you on ground you've chosen. She was quiet. Then there's a man in Copper Ridge named Aldous Garth. He's a county assessor, not ambitious, not corrupt, but thorough. He keeps records of property inquiries, land transactions, complaints. If Rask has been maneuvering toward acquiring Silver Briar, there may be a paper trail that Garth has without knowing its significance. Can you get to Garth without it looking like you're investigating Rask? I have legitimate business in Copper Ridge next week. I need to file the seasonal rider contracts with the county office anyway. She tapped the desk once. I can speak to Garth about general property records as a matter of routine. Harlan nodded. And I'll stay here and make sure nothing else goes wrong. Yes, Lenora said. Don't let anything else go wrong. He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. The weeks that followed settled into something that felt, on the surface, like ordinary winter ranch routine. Harlan ran the morning stable rounds before anyone else was awake. He met with Cal and Dix each afternoon to review the day's work and the following day's priorities. He He tracked the recovering horse's progress with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the body horse, or otherwise, could not be hurried on its own timeline. He ate supper most evenings in the cottage with Owen, who had taken to bringing home observations from school the way other children brought home drawings, presenting them at the table with a critical directness that kept the suppers interesting. "Pruitt explained westward expansion today," Owen said one evening. "What did he say about it?" "He said it was progress." "And what did you think?" Owen chewed for a moment. "I think progress for some people meant getting pushed off land for other people. So I'm not sure progress is exactly the right word." Harlan looked at his son for a moment. "That's a fairly complicated thought. I told Pruitt that." "What did Pruitt say?" "He said I raised a valid point and then moved on to something else very quickly." Harlan said, "That's often how valid points are handled." Owen considered this philosophically and had more potatoes. But beneath the surface of ordinary routine, things were moving. Cal identified Briggs twice in January, once on the road north of the property, riding slowly in the direction of the ranch's south gate, and once near the water crossing half a mile east, where he appeared to be checking the condition of the ice on the creek. Both times, as Harlan had instructed, Cal watched and said nothing, and came directly to Harlan afterward. What was he doing at the crossing? Harlan asked the second time. Hard to say. Standing, looking at the water. Silver Briar's water rights run through that crossing. Cal looked at him. You think they're looking at the water, too. The land and the water together are what make this ranch what it is. If Rask wants the property, he wants both. Harlan thought for a moment. The water rights, are they documented? Registered properly with the county? I'd have to ask Mrs. Ashbourne. He asked her that evening. Lenora paused in the middle of reviewing a feeding schedule. My husband registered them in 1878. I had them reviewed when I took our property in 1882. They should be current. She paused again. Should be. Would you know if there had been any challenge to them? Any formal challenge would have come through the county office. Garth would have record of it. She set the feeding schedule down. I'm in Copper Ridge on Thursday. I know. I'll ask about the water rights specifically. Don't ask specifically. Ask in the context of reviewing your general property documentation. Lenora looked at him steadily. You're teaching me to be careful about how I ask questions. You are already careful about how you ask questions, Harlan said. I'm just suggesting a direction. She made a small sound that might have been a near law and went back to the feeding schedule. She came back from Copper Ridge on a Thursday evening with cold reddened cheeks and a quiet that Harlan recognized, after 2 months, as the quiet she used when she'd learned something that required processing before speaking. She waited until Owen was in the loft. Then she sat at the table in the main house and told him what Garth had found, or rather, what Garth had shown her while talking about other things, not realizing the significance of what she was looking at. There's a filing, she said, from November. A preliminary water rights dispute, not against Silver Briar specifically, but against the creek watershed that includes our crossing, filed by a land company called Meridian Holdings. Harlan said, Is that a Rask company? Garth doesn't know who owns Meridian Holdings. It's filed in the territorial records as a company out of Helena, but the contact name is a lawyer Rask has used before on other matters. She folded her hands on the table. If the water rights are challenged and ruled ambiguous, even temporarily it affects the ranch's value, its ability to secure contracts, everything. And if the ranch's value drops at the right moments, he comes in with a purchase offer at a price I might feel pressured to accept. Her voice was level, but her hands were pressed flat on the table with a tension that showed in the tendons. It's patient. It's organized. He's been planning this for a while. Harlan thought about the letter, dated 10 days before the feed contamination. He planned the feed situation to be the visible pressure, he said, and the water rights challenge to be the structural pressure that you wouldn't discover until the visible pressure had already worn you down. Yes, he's good at this. He's been doing it for 20 years, Lenora said. I know of at least 3 ranchers who sold to him under what they thought were ordinary market conditions. It wasn't until afterward that they understood what had been happening. Harlan was quiet. You said something earlier, Lenora said, about making him come to you on ground you've chosen. I remember. What does that mean for this situation specifically? He looked at the table. Not at her at the table, at the grain of the wood, which was something he did when he was arranging thoughts in sequence. She'd noticed this too. He organized things internally before he put them into words, which made him sometimes slow to answer but rarely wrong when he did. The water rights challenge, he said. Who filed it, Meridian Holdings? What's the timeline on a territorial water dispute? Months. Sometimes longer. The county has to formally investigate, notify affected parties. So if you respond to the filing properly, on time, with complete documentation of your existing rights, the process stalls in your favor while the investigation proceeds. Yes, but... And if Ras thinks you don't know about the filing yet, Harlan said he's not going to rush. He'll let the water process move slowly while he waits for the feed situation and the general winter pressure to make you feel uncertain. Lenora looked at him. He needs you to feel uncertain, Harlan said. Everything he's doing is designed to create that feeling. The letter, the contamination, the water filing, they're not meant to destroy Silver Briar immediately. They're meant to make you feel like you're barely holding it together. And then he shows up with an offer that seems like relief. She was very still. So we don't feel uncertain, she said. We don't act uncertain. We respond to the water filing quietly and completely. We keep the ranch running without visible disruption. We document everything we've found about the feed contamination, carefully, without going to the authorities yet. He paused, and we wait for him to make a move that he can't pull back from. What kind of move? I don't know yet, but he'll make one. Patient people always do, eventually, because patience isn't infinite, and at some point, the plan needs to produce results. Harlan looked up at her. When he moves, I want to be ready. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You came here with 51 cents and a child and no plan for what came next. Now you're talking about catching Edmund Rask in a scheme he spent 20 years refining. Yes. That doesn't worry you? It worries me plenty, Harlan said. But worrying about it and refusing to do it are two different things. She looked at him across the table for a long moment, with an expression that was difficult to categorize. Not exactly warmth, not exactly admiration. Something more complicated, the specific look of someone who has been managing alone for a long time, and is feeling, for the first time in a while, that someone else is genuinely thinking about the same problem they are. Okay, she said, just that. Okay, like it was simple. Like it wasn't the most complicated thing either of them had agreed to in years. February arrived the way February always arrived in Montana, without asking and without apology. The cold deepened. The days were short, and the nights were very long, and the wind off the mountains had an edge to it that made everything take twice as long. Harlan's hands cracked at the knuckles from the constant cold and the constant work, and he wrapped them at night with strips of cloth that Owen had quietly produced from somewhere without being asked. Where did you get this? Harlan said. Mrs. Ashbourne, Owen said. I told her your hands were cracked. Harlan looked at the cloth strips. She said it was just linen. She said she had more than she needed. You didn't need to tell her that. Your hands were cracking, Owen said simply. It seemed like relevant information to share with someone who had linen. Harlan couldn't argue with the logic of this, so he didn't try. It was the second week of February when Fletcher came to him. Fletcher, who was 23 and moved fast and thought fast and often finished one before the other, came to find Harlan in the north section of the stable on a Tuesday morning and stood in the stall doorway with his hat in his hands and the specific look of a man who has been working up to saying something for a while and is trying to get through it before he loses the nerve. I need to tell you something, Fletcher said. Harlan kept working because stopping what he was doing would make it into more of an event than Fletcher could handle. Go ahead. 3 weeks ago, before the horses got sick, Fletcher turned his hat brim around in his hands. A man came to the gate. I was doing the evening rounds. He said he was from a feed supplier, checking on a delivery. He had papers looked like actual paperwork, an invoice or something. I let him in and showed him where the feed room was. Harlan stopped working. He turned and looked at Fletcher. Fletcher met his eyes for about 2 seconds and then looked at the hat. He went in alone. I had the horses to finish, so I left him. He was gone when I came back around. I thought he was from the supplier. The papers looked real. What did this man look like? Thin, light hair, rode a bay with a split ear. Fletcher looked up. You know him. I know of him. Harlan set down the brush he'd been using. You didn't say anything for 3 weeks. I was scared. Fletcher's voice was flat with the specific flatness of someone who is past trying to sound anything other than what he is. I figured out what must have happened, and I was scared, and I didn't know what to do, and I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I am. Harlan looked at him for a long time. Fletcher was 23 and scared, and had made a mistake that had cost the ranch 3 miserable weeks and 7 sick horses and more sleepless nights than Harlan wanted to count. He was also, clearly, telling the truth now, at cost to himself, when he could have kept quiet indefinitely and probably never been caught. "What did the papers look like?" Harlan said. Fletcher blinked. "What?" "The paperwork he had. Describe it." "It was like an invoice. Had the Silver Briar name on it. The supplier name was I can't remember exactly. Something Ridge. Copper Ridge Grain, maybe? Copper Ridge Grain doesn't deliver to this ranch. Our feed supplier is Halloran's out of Billings." Harlan watched Fletcher absorb this, which means the paperwork was forged. "I didn't know that." "I know you didn't know that. That's why it worked." Harlan picked up the brush again. "Go about your work." Fletcher stood there. "That's it? What did you think would happen?" "I thought I don't know. I thought you'd fire me." "I might have fired you 3 weeks ago," Harlan said. "Right now you've just given me information I needed, and you told the truth when you didn't have to. Those 2 things count for something." He looked at Fletcher steadily. "But if you see anyone on this property you don't recognize, anything that seems off, you come to me immediately." "Not 3 weeks later, immediately." "Yes," Fletcher said. "Yes, sir." He left quickly with the compressed relief of someone who'd been carrying something heavy and had just been allowed to put it down. Harlan stood in the stall for a moment, forged paperwork. Briggs had come on to Silver Briar with forged documents, posing as a supplier representative, walked into the feed room unaccompanied. That required planning. That required knowing the ranch's supplier arrangements well enough to create a convincing forgery. That required knowing who was doing evening rounds and when, and knowing that a young and trusting hand like Fletcher would be easy to get past. That was not opportunistic. That was organized. That was someone who had been watching Silver Briar carefully for a while. He thought about Lenora's face the night she'd come back from Copper Ridge. The way she'd pressed her hands flat on the table. The way she'd said, "He's been planning this for a while," with the tone of someone who was only now beginning to understand the full size of what they were dealing with. He finished the stall work and went to find her. He found her in the training paddock with a young quarter horse named Ace, who was 2 years old and promising and inclined to test his limits with the particular arrogance of youth. She was working him on a long line, walking him in circles, correcting a shoulder-dropping habit that, if left alone, would become a functional problem by the time he was old enough for serious work. She saw Harlan coming and didn't stop what she was doing, which he'd learned was her way. She didn't perform awareness of people approaching. She just absorbed them into whatever she was already doing and dealt with them when it made sense. He waited at the fence until she brought Ace in and handed him off to Dix. "Fletcher," he said when she reached him. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. Her face changed once, a slight tightening around the eyes when he described the forged paperwork, and then went still again. "He came back from Copper Ridge, confident enough to use forged documents," she said, "which means he had access to our supplier records. Or an educated guess based on the ranch's previous arrangements. The foreman who died," Lenora said slowly, "Harmon. He handled all the feed contracts. Who else had access to those records? Anyone who went through his papers after he died, looking for active contracts." She paused. "I went through them myself. I gave copies of the active contracts to Cal so he could manage the winter feeds while I was looking for a foreman." "Where did Cal keep the copies?" "The tack room. In the storage cabinet." She stopped. "Which is not locked." They looked at each other. "Briggs could have gotten into the tack room," Harlan said. "Or someone told him what was in it. Or both." The paddock was quiet except for Ace shifting his weight against the fence rail and the wind pushing at the upper branches of the cottonwoods. "We have Fletcher's testimony," Harlan said. "We have a description of Briggs. We have the pattern of contamination that a veterinarian could potentially verify as deliberate. And we have the water rights filing by a company that links to Rask's lawyer. That's not enough for the territorial authorities." "No, not yet." Lenora turned to look out over the paddock. The winter light was flat and white and made everything look slightly brittle. "When does it become enough?" she said. Not frustrated, just asking. "When we catch someone in the act," Harlan said. "Or when we get someone to talk." Lenora turned back. "Briggs. If Briggs knows what he did to those horses could be treated as deliberate poisoning, he'd be looking at real legal consequences. That's a different conversation than being Rask's errand man. You want to approach Briggs?" "Not yet." But if we can put him on this property again on our terms with witnesses, that's a different situation than what we have now. She studied him. You keep saying our. He looked at her. Our terms, our situation. She said it without any particular weight, just noting it. He didn't have an answer for that immediately. The truth was, he'd started thinking of Silver Briar as our sometime in the middle of February without noticing exactly when the shift had happened. He'd been aware of it afterward, in the way you become aware of a door you've already walked through, not able to identify the precise moment of crossing, just certain you're on the other side. I meant the ranch, she said. I know what you meant, she said. And then she went back inside, and he stood at the paddock fence for another minute, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods. And somewhere across the ridge, Edmund Rask's plan was proceeding on its careful timeline, and it had no idea what was building against it. The plan Harlan had described at the paddock fence, waiting for Rask to make a move that couldn't be pulled back, sounded reasonable in the cold light of a February afternoon. It sounded less reasonable at 3 a.m. when he was lying awake in the cottage, listening to the windwork at the roof seams, and running through everything that could go wrong before Rask made that move. There were a lot of things that could go wrong. He's been in situations before where being right at about the problem wasn't enough, where you understood exactly what was happening and still couldn't stop it, because the person doing it had more money, more connections, more time. He'd watch his father understand precisely how the drought and the debt were going to take the Wyoming breeding operation and be unable to stop either one anyway. Understanding the mechanism of a thing did not automatically give you the lever to halt it. So he lay there running worst cases until around 4, when he gave up and got dressed and went to the stable. The horses settled him. They always had. There was something about the particular quality of a barn at that hour, the warmth of the animals, the sound of their breathing, the smell of hay and horse and leather, that put him in a state somewhere between alertness and calm that he couldn't reproduce anywhere else. He walked to the stalls slowly, checking each animal without a candle, navigating by the faint ambient light and memory of the layout. All 7 recovering horses were holding steady. He stopped at the mare's stall last. She was standing with her head low, half asleep, and she raised it when he came to the door and regarded him with the drowsy patience of an animal that had stopped being surprised by his presence at odd hours. "You're fine," he told her. She lowered her head again. He leaned against the stall door and thought about Edmund Rask. The thing about Rask was that he was patient and organized and had 20 years of experience maneuvering people into positions where they did what he wanted them to do. Those were real advantages. But patient and organized also meant committed to a particular sequence. Rask had a plan, and the plan had a shape. And if you understood the shape, you could sometimes predict where the next pressure would come from. The water rights challenge was structural. It would move through legal channels over some months. And Rask wouldn't interfere with that process directly because he didn't need to. The feed contamination was direct pressure, immediate disruption, meant to create financial and reputational damage. It had failed to create a crisis. Rask would know that by now if Briggs was reporting back. So the next move would be escalation, not more subtle, more direct. Something designed to create a visible, undeniable problem that would be harder to quietly recover from. He was still thinking about this when the stable door opened at the far end. He turned. Cal stood in the doorway with a lantern and an expression that Harlan had learned to read. "As I have been awake for a while, and I've been thinking." "You couldn't sleep either," Harlan said. "I don't sleep much in winter generally," Cal said. He came down the row of stalls and hung the lantern on the post hook outside the mare's stall. "I wanted to check on her myself. She's fine." Cal looked through the stall door and satisfied himself of this. Then he leaned against the opposite wall. "I've been thinking about Briggs." "So have I. He'll come back. You said it yourself, one contamination event isn't enough for what Rask is trying to do." "Right. But he won't use the same approach twice." Fletcher identified him. Even if Fletcher didn't say anything for 3 weeks, Briggs doesn't know that he'd have to assume the boy might have mentioned the visit to someone eventually. Cal crossed his arms. "So next time it won't be the feed room." Harlan looked at him. "What do you think it'll be?" Cal was quiet for a moment. "The water crossing." Harlan waited. "I've been going over it," Cal said. "The land and the water together is what makes Silver Briar what it is. You said that yourself. The feed contamination hit the horses, which hits the operation. But if something happened to the water crossing itself, if the creek diversion got damaged, or the access road to it got cut, that's not recoverable in a week. That's a seasonal problem. Harlan thought about Briggs at the crossing, standing, looking at the ice. He was checking whether the ice was thick enough to work on, Harlan said, or checking whether someone working on it would be visible from the road. They looked at each other in the lantern light. We need someone watching that crossing, Harlan said. I was going to say the same thing. Not obviously. Not standing there, waiting that spooks them, and they back off and try something else we haven't anticipated. I know a spot, Cal said. On the east bank, there's a stand of cottonwoods where the ground rises a little before it drops to the water. You can see the whole crossing from up there, and nobody on the crossing can see you unless they know to look. How far is it from the ranch? 20 minutes on horseback. 12 if you push. Harlan nodded slowly. We set a rotation. 2 men, alternating. Different times each day so it doesn't become predictable. He paused. We don't tell anyone except who needs to know. Fletcher? Not yet. Cal accepted this without argument. I'll take the first watch tomorrow. Before light. I'll take the afternoon. Cal unhooked the lantern from the post. He started toward the door, then stopped. You know Rask's been in this territory since before I was born. That's not nothing. Men like him, they've got people everywhere. Not because they pay everyone, but because they've done enough favors over the years that people feel they owe something back. I know, Harlan said. I'm not saying it to discourage you. I'm saying it so you're not surprised when something comes at you from a direction you weren't looking. That's useful advice. It's what I'd want someone to tell me. Cal left. The lantern went with him and the stable went back to its dark quiet, and Harlan stood with the mare breathing softly on the other side of the stall door and thought about things coming from directions he wasn't looking. The direction he wasn't looking turned out to be the schoolhouse. Not Rask, not Briggs. Something smaller and in its way more corrosive. Owen came home from school on a Wednesday with the specific silence of a child who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. Harlan recognized this particular silence from 2 years of raising a boy who processed things internally before surfacing them. It had the texture of deliberateness, not sullenness. He let it sit through supper. When he was clearing the plates, Owen said, without preamble, Tommy Rask said something today. Harlan set the plates down carefully. Tommy Rask. Edmund Rask's grandson. He's 11. He goes to the schoolhouse. Owen looked at the table. He said his grandfather told his father that you're a drifter who tricked Mrs. Ashbourne into giving you a job, and that when people figure out what you really are, you and me are going to be back on the road by spring. The kitchen was very quiet. He said it in front of everyone, Harlan said. In front of most everyone. At the lunch break. And what did you say? Owen looked up. His face had the particular set it got when he was angry, but had decided to be controlled about it. I said, my father has been here 2 months, and the horses are in better shape than they've been in a year. And maybe Tommy should ask his grandfather why he spends so much time worrying about our ranch instead of his own. Harlan looked at his son. Then Pruitt came out, and we went inside, Owen said. Did any of the other kids say anything? Not to me. But Tommy's got friends, and I'm still the new one. Owen paused. Is it true that we might have to leave by spring? No, Harlan said. It's not true. How do you know? Because I'm not going to let it happen, is what he wanted to say, and he caught himself before he did, remembering what Owen had said about not being able to stop everything just by working hard enough. Because I understand what's happening, he said instead, and I'm working on it. And because Mrs. Ashbourne is not going to be pressured into a decision she doesn't want to make. Owen considered this. Rask's trying to take the ranch. It was not a question. Where did you— I'm 9, Owen said. I'm not simple. Harlan looked at his son for a long moment. Then he sat down across from him at the table. Yes. We think Edmund Rask is trying to force Mrs. Ashbourne to sell Silver Briar. He's been creating problems for the ranch to make it look financially troubled. And the sick horses. We think someone he hired contaminated the feed. Owen absorbed this with the same seriousness he applied to everything. So Tommy's saying that at school that's part of it? Maybe. Or maybe Edmund told his family what he thinks is going to happen, and Tommy repeated it without understanding it was strategy. Harlan paused. Either way, don't engage with him about it anymore. You made your point once. That's enough. What if he says it again? Then you walk away. You don't need to win a schoolyard argument. The argument that matters is happening somewhere else. Owen looked at him steadily. Where? Here, Harlan said. In this ranch. Every day we keep it running well. We're winning the argument that matters. Owen sat with this for a while. Then Mrs. Ashbourne should know about Tommy. I'll tell her. Tonight? Yes, Owen. Tonight. He told her that evening. She listened with the same stillness she brought to hard information, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, Edmund talked to his family about this, which means it's not as contained as he'd like it to be, or he's confident enough in the outcome that he doesn't feel he needs to contain it. She was at her desk, but she'd turned away from it to face him, which was the posture she used when she was fully attending to something rather than partly. He thinks this is close to over, which might make him impatient. Edmund Rask is not an impatient man. Every man is impatient when he thinks he's already won. Harlan paused. Owen handled it well, by the way. Whatever Tommy said, Owen came back and told me directly and didn't get into a fight about it. Something shifted in Lenora's expression. He's a good boy. He's better than I deserve, honestly. Don't say that. It's true. It's not true, she said, with a sharpness that surprised him. What he is comes from somewhere, Harlan. Children don't become that way by accident. He didn't have an answer for that, so he said nothing. I'm going to write to my lawyer in Billings, she said, turning back to her desk. I want the water rights documentation reviewed and a formal response to the Meridian Holdings filing prepared. If Rask thinks he can challenge those rights, I want it on record that we responded completely and immediately. Good. And I want to speak to Sheriff Alderman. Harlan paused. I thought we were waiting. I'm not asking Alderman to investigate. I want to have a conversation, a casual one, about the general situation on the property. The contaminated feed, the man we believe came in with forged paperwork. Nothing accusatory. Just establishing a record that there have been incidents. She held his gaze. If something bigger happens, I want Alderman to already know the context. He thought about this. It was careful. It was exactly the right kind of careful. When? He comes for supper next week. I won't be at that supper, Harlan said. She looked at him. I know. I'll handle Alderman. He nodded. He understood why he shouldn't be there. A new foreman of 2 months, at a supper with the county sheriff, discussing suspicious incidents on the ranch, would look like exactly the kind of thing it was. Better for it to be Lenora alone, on her own ground, with her own 10-year relationship with the man. Be careful how much you tell him. I know how to talk to Alderman, she said. Not impatiently, just factually. Right, he said. He went back to the cottage. The snowstorm came without much warning on a Friday night in late February. That was not unusual for Montana, but this one had a violence to it that went beyond ordinary winter weather. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 4 hours, and the wind came in from the northwest with the kind of sustained force that found every gap in every structure and made the stable walls creak in a way that was not particularly comforting when you had 43 horses inside them. Harlan and Cal reinforced the main stable doors at 6 in the evening when the storm was still building, adding a secondary brace against the wind pressure. By 8, the visibility outside was close to nothing. By 9, the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and the horses in the main stable were restless in the specific way that horses get restless when a storm crosses some internal threshold from manageable to alarming. He was in the main stable at 10, moving through the stalls one more time, when he heard it. A sound that was wrong. Not the wind, not the horses. Something lower and more irregular, a rhythmic creak from the north end of the stable that was different from the weather creak of the boards. He stood still, there it was again, and then a sharp sound, not wood settling. Something being forced. He went to the north end fast, not running but close to it. The north gate of the main stable was a large sliding mechanism, heavy timber on iron rollers that connected the main building to the training paddock. It was used in good weather and barred in bad. He'd barred it himself at 6 that evening. The bar was on the floor. The gate was open 2 feet, and the cold coming through the gap was ferocious. And on the other side in the paddock, barely visible through the driving snow, there were shapes, movement, and behind him the horses were starting. The nearest ones felt the cold and heard whatever was beyond the gate, and the sound went through the stable in that particular wave. Animal to animal, the way fear moves through a herd, not contagion but resonance. Each horse picking up and amplifying what the last one felt, and within 30 seconds the main stable was full of the sound of horses that had gone from restless to frightened. Harlan grabbed the gate and tried to force it back. Something was blocking it from the outside. He put his full weight into it. The gate moved an inch, then resisted. Whatever was wedged against the outside was solid, a timber, maybe, or a post. And the horses behind him were escalating, and he could hear the specific crash of hooves against stall boards and somewhere at the far end of the stable a horse slammed its weight against the gate hard enough that the whole wall shuddered. He let go of the gate. He had maybe 2 minutes before the herd fear crossed the line from frightened to panicking, and a panicking horse in an enclosed space was dangerous to itself, to the other horses, and to any human being in the vicinity. He ran back through the stable, pulling stall doors open, as he went, not releasing the horses into chaos, but giving them the option of movement if the situation inside got worse. This was counterintuitive enough that most people never did it. It was also, in his experience, the thing that prevented stampedes in enclosed spaces, because a horse with a visible exit option did not become as desperate as a horse that felt trapped. He was 3 stalls down when the stable door from the house side opened and Lenora came through it. She was in her coat and boots, and she'd been awake. "North gate," Harlan said, not stopping. Someone blocked it from outside. "Get Cal, I need another person on the inside while I go around the outside." "Harlan, the horses are going to panic. Cal knows what to do. Get him." She turned and went. He pulled 2 more stall doors before she came back with Cal, and then he went out through the house side stable door and into the storm. The wind hit him like a wall. He couldn't see more than 8 feet in front of him, and his eyes started to water immediately from the cold, which made it worse. He kept one hand on the stable wall and moved along it, around the corner, toward the north end, counting steps, because that was the only way to orient himself in zero visibility. He found the gate by nearly walking into it. There was a heavy post wedged against it from the outside, not dropped there accidentally, not blown there by the wind, but placed deliberately at an angle to maximize the leverage against the gate's slide. He grabbed it and heaved it clear, and the gate swung back, and the rush of slightly warmer air from inside the stable came out like a breath. And in the paddock, visible now because he was close enough, a figure was moving fast toward the paddock's far fence, running. Harlan went after him. He didn't think about it. The decision happened before he consciously made it, the way decisions do when the body has already calculated that stopping means losing the only direct evidence he had. He ran through the driving snow with his arms up against his face and his feet, finding the frozen ground by feel rather than sight, and the figure ahead of him growing, slightly less distinct, slightly faster. He was gaining. The figure hit the far fence and went up and over it, quick, practiced, and landed on the other side. Harlan hit the fence and stopped. He was not as young as whoever was on the other side. He was 36 and had been working 12-hour days in brutal cold for 2 months, and his knees knew every year of it. He got one hand on the top rail, then his foot slipped on the ice at the fence base, and he went down sideways, and one knee hit the frozen ground hard enough that the pain was white and immediate, and he stayed there for a moment with one hand on the rail and the storm coming over him. The figure was gone. He stayed down for 3 seconds. 4, his knee screamed. He pushed himself up and stood there at the fence, looking into the darkness where the figure had disappeared, and his breath came in, hard, visible clouds, and the wind drove snow into the side of his face, and the figure was gone. He turned back. The paddock gate was a mess. Someone had come in over the far fence, same approach, same athletic efficiency, and blocked the north stable gate, and then gone back over before Harlan got there. Quick, deliberate, well planned. He limped back to the stable door. Inside, Cal and Lenora and Fletcher and Dix had the horses under control barely. 2 of the stalls he'd opened had horses loose in the main corridor, but neither animal was running, just moving in the tight, compressed way of frightened things that have found a slightly larger space. Cal was with one of them, a big gray named Porter, keeping his hand on the horse's neck and talking to him in the low, steady voice that didn't mean anything specifically but meant everything generally. Fletcher was at the far end with the other loose horse, the anxious mare from the south end, and doing better than Harlan would have expected, staying calm, keeping himself sideways to her so she didn't feel cornered. Lenora was in the middle of the corridor. She saw Harlan come in. She looked at his face, then at his knee, then at his face again. "Did you get him?" she said. "No." "Are you hurt?" "The knee." "It's fine. It's not fine. It'll be fine by morning." He moved past the edge of assessment into practicality because that was how he handled things that hurt. "The gate is clear. Let's get the horses back in their stalls, and then I need to look at the outside of that gate." Harlan, after the horses, Lenora. She pressed her lips together and went to help Cal with Porter. It took 40 minutes to settle the stable fully. The 2 loose horses went back into their stalls without much resistance. Both of them wanted the stall once the immediate fear had passed. which was the thing about horses that most people didn't understand. They weren't brave and they weren't cowardly. They were pragmatic. A stall that was safe was a stall they wanted to be in. When the last door was latched and the stable had quieted to the ordinary sounds of an anxious herd returning to baseline, Harlan took a lantern and went back to the north gate. Someone had done 3 things in rapid sequence during the storm: entered the paddock over the far fence, wedged the timber against the inside of the north gate, and then opened the gate enough to let the cold and noise and fear in. Then they'd gone back over the fence before anyone could get to them. The goal hadn't been to release the horses. The goal had been to panic them. A panicking herd in an enclosed space in a storm, horses slamming against stall boards, kicking, throwing themselves sideways, could injure or kill each other, could injure anyone inside the stable, could create enough visible damage and chaos to make it into a story that traveled. Silver Briar loses horses in winter incident, mismanagement suspected. And if any of the horses had been seriously injured tonight, that would have been the story. Not contaminated feed that recovered quietly. A visible, documented, verifiable loss. He crouched by the gate and looked at the timber they'd used as a wedge. It was a fence post not from Silver Briar's fencing, which he knew on sight. The wood was a different color, slightly different weight. They'd brought it with them. This was not an opportunistic act. Someone had ridden out in a blizzard with a fence post and a plan. He carried the post back inside and left it by the wall. Lenora was waiting. Cal and Fletcher and Dix had gone to their bunks, Cal with the reluctance of a man who wanted to stay but understood he wasn't needed. Lenora was sitting on the feed chest near the center of the stable, with her coat still on, and her hands wrapped around a cup of something she'd brought from the house, at some point coffee, probably, or whatever passed for it, at this hour. She watched him bring the post in. They brought it with them, he said, setting it against the wall. I see that. Someone rode out in this storm with that post and a plan to spook the herd. Yes. That's not Briggs acting on general instructions. That's specific direction from someone who knows what a panicked herd in a closed stable in winter can do. He looked at her. Rask understands horses. He's been ranching for 40 years. So he knew exactly what could happen tonight if this worked. Lenora was quiet. He went further than feed contamination, Harlan said. That was inconvenience. This could have killed horses. Could have killed Cal. Could have killed you if you'd been in here when it started. I know. That changes the nature of what we're dealing with. I know that too. Her voice was steady, but her hands around the cup were tight. What does it change about what we do? Harlan sat on the bench across from her. His knee was going to be a problem tomorrow, but tonight it was still running on enough adrenaline to be manageable. We can't wait as long as I thought, he said. He's escalating faster than I expected, and if the next escalation is worse than tonight. What would be worse than tonight? If one of those horses had been seriously hurt. If the fire... He stopped. She looked at him. The stable's wooden, he said. Everything's wooden. If someone wanted to create a truly catastrophic incident... Don't say it, Lenora said. I have to say it. We have to think about it. She set the cup down very carefully on the feed chest. Then what do? We go to Alderman now, Harlan said. Not next week when he comes for supper. Tomorrow. We take the fence post. We take Fletcher's account of Briggs coming in with forged papers. We take what Cal saw at the water crossing, and we go to Alderman and we lay it out. We still don't have direct evidence connecting any of this to Rask. We have evidence of deliberate sabotage of this ranch. That's enough to get Alderman asking questions. And once Alderman starts asking questions, Harlan paused. Briggs knows Briggs is exposed. And an exposed man is a man who starts thinking about who he's more afraid of, Rask or a territorial court. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. You think Briggs will talk? I think Briggs will talk if he understands his situation clearly enough. He's not loyal. He's paid. Those are different things. She picked up the coffee cup again and looked at it. Alderman has known Edmund Rask for 30 years. I know, he's not corrupt, but he's cautious. About Rask specifically. Is he more cautious about Rask than he is about someone potentially setting fire to a horse stable in his county? The question sat between them. No, she said finally. He's not. Then we go tomorrow. She nodded. He stood up. His knee argued with him about it, but he got there. Harlan, she said. He turned. She had put the coffee cup down, and she was looking at him with an expression that was complicated by tiredness and something else, something he couldn't immediately name. She said, When I walked across that supper house in Copper Ridge and told you to sit down, I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, I thought I did. I thought I was hiring a foreman. You were hiring a foreman. I was doing something more complicated than that, and I didn't know it yet. She paused. I want you to know that what you did tonight coming around to that gate in the storm, going after him. I didn't catch him. That's not the point. I fell on my knee like an old man. Harlan. Her voice had a sharpness to it that stopped him. I'm trying to say something. He waited. Thank you, she said, for not treating this ranch like it's just your job. He stood there in the winter stable with the horses breathing quietly around them, and the storm working at the walls, and the lantern making the shadows move. And he thought about what to say, and couldn't find the right words for it, so he just said, "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." He left her there and went back to the cottage. He didn't tell her that on the way back from the fence with his knee wrong, and his visibility near zero, and the figure gone into the dark, he'd had one terrible involuntary moment of thinking, if this goes badly, where does Owen go? And the fact that he'd thought it, that Silver Briar and Lenora and the whole situation had gotten deep enough into him that losing it had acquired a new and specific weight, that was something he was going to have to sit with for a while before he understood what to do about it. He went to Alderman the next morning. Not Lenora, he'd reconsidered on this overnight. Lenora going to the sheriff as a woman alone reporting suspicious incidents was one conversation. Lenora going with her new foreman, whom Alderman didn't know, was a different and more complicated conversation. Better for her to go first, alone, than for Harlan to speak to Alderman separately if the sheriff asked. She took the fence post and a written account of the feed contamination and left for town at 8. Owen was at school. Harlan was in the stable with his bad knee and a list of things that needed doing, and he worked through the list methodically and tried not to think about how the conversation with Alderman was going. He was in the north section, checking the gate mechanism for damage from the night before, when Cal appeared. Someone at the south gate, Cal said, asking for Mrs. Ashbourne. Harlan turned. Who? Says his name is Garland, the feed merchant. Harlan was still for a moment. Garland, the man Lenora had changed her supply arrangements with, without explaining why. The man who'd provided the feed for the eastern stable the first contamination. What does he want? Says he wants to discuss a billing matter. Says there's been a misunderstanding. A billing matter, Harlan said. That's what he said. Put him in the barn office. Tell him Mrs. Ashbourne is out and her foreman will speak with him. Cal looked at him. You sure? I'm sure. Garland was a soft man, not fat. Just soft in the way of people who'd spent their adult lives indoors, managing other people's physical work. He was perhaps 45, with a merchant's habit of adjusting his coat when uncomfortable, which he did twice in the first 30 seconds of being in the barn office. He looked at Harlan with the calibrating expression of a man trying to figure out what he was dealing with before he said anything he couldn't unsay. Mister, he said. Vey, I'm the ranch foreman. I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Ashbourne directly. She's unavailable. Is there a billing matter I can help with? Garland adjusted his coat. There seems to have been some confusion about the Eastern supply contract. Mrs. Ashbourne terminated the arrangement without notice, which isn't. There wasn't a contractual notice period in that arrangement, Harlan said. I checked the agreement when I arrived. Month-to-month supply, terminable by either party. Garland blinked. You checked the agreement. I check all the ranch's supply agreements. It's part of the foreman's work. Harlan kept his voice level, businesslike. Was there something specific about the billing? Garland was quiet for a moment. He adjusted his coat again. Then he said, I was asked to inquire by a third party about the ranch's plans for the spring season. Whether Mrs. Ashbourne intends to maintain operations at the current scale, or whether... Who asked you to inquire? Garland stopped. You said a third party asked you to come here, Harlan said. Who was it? I don't think that's relevant to the billing discussion. There's no billing discussion. You said yourself the contract was terminable without notice. You came here for a different reason, and you're trying to dress it up as a business matter. Harlan leaned back in the chair and looked at Garland steadily. I want you to go back to whoever sent you and tell them that Silver Briar is operating at full capacity. The horses are healthy. The spring contracts are in place. And Mrs. Ashbourne has no intention of making any changes to her property situation. Garland stared at him. Can you remember all that? Harlan said. Or would you like me to write it down? Garland stood. I don't appreciate the implication. I haven't implied anything. I've told you directly what message to carry back. Harlan stood as well, which brought him to roughly the same height as Garland, and required no additional effort to be the more solid presence in the room. "Have a safe ride back to town, Mr. Garland." Garland left. Harlan watched him go from the barn office door, then watched the south gate close behind the man's horse, and then he stood there in the cold for a moment, with his knee aching, and the storm of the previous night still visible in the churned and refrozen mud of the paddock. Rask had sent Garland to assess. After the failed stable incident, he wanted to know whether Silver Briar was shaken enough to receive an offer. He'd sent the softest person in his operation, a merchant, not a ranch hand, to have a polite conversation and gauge the response. What he was going to hear back was a message Harlan had delivered with complete deliberateness. "We are fine, we know you're watching, and we are not afraid." That would either slow Rask down or push him to something larger. Harlan walked back toward the main stable and thought, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the weather, let him push. Because when Edmund Rask finally made the move, that couldn't be pulled back, the move made in anger rather than patience. That was when his 20 years of careful planning became the very thing that worked against him. Patient men were hard to catch in the slow work, but an impatient patient man pushed past his tolerance that was a different animal entirely. Harlan went back to work. His knee hurt. The horses needed feeding. And somewhere in Copper Ridge, Lenora Ashbourne was sitting across from a sheriff who'd known Edmund Rask for 30 years, laying out a case that would either set something in motion or hit a wall. He wasn't there for that conversation. He had to trust that she could handle it. He did trust it. That, he realized as he lifted the first bale of the morning, was a thing that had changed somewhere between the supper house in December and this February morning in the cold, that trusting Lenora Ashbourne to handle something he couldn't see or control had stopped feeling like uncertainty and started feeling like simply the way things were between people who were in something together. He didn't look too closely at what that meant. He just fed the horses. Lenora came back from Copper Ridge at 3:30 in the afternoon with cold, stiffened hands and the particular expression she wore when something had gone better than expected, but not as well as hoped. Harlan was at the fence line on the north side, checking the posts for damage from the storm, when he heard the wagon and came around to meet her. She handed him the reins without being asked a small thing, but he'd noticed she'd started doing it, this unconscious extension of practical trust, and he tied the horse while she climbed down. "Alderman listened," she said before he could ask. And? He listened carefully. He asked good questions. He took the fence post and wrote down what I told him about Fletcher and Briggs. She pulled her gloves off and tucked them under her arm. And then he said he'd need to make some inquiries before he could take any formal action, which means Rask, which means he's going to have a conversation with Rask before he does anything official. She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. I expected it. Alderman's a fair man, but he's also a careful one, and careful men in this territory don't move against Edmund Rask without looking twice. Did he say when? Within the week. She started toward the house. He also told me something I didn't know. Harlan followed her. There are 2 other ranchers in this county who've had incidents in the past 18 months, she said. Amos Creedy lost 3 horses to what was called a disease outbreak last spring. And Martin Pollard had a water dispute with a company he'd never heard of that cost him 4 months of lawyer's fees before it was dropped. Harlan stopped walking. Lenora looked back at him. "Creedy sold his land 8 months ago," she said, "to Meridian Holdings, the same company that filed the water rights challenge against Silver Briar." Yes. He stood there in the cold afternoon light and felt the shape of it assembling itself, not just Silver Briar, not just one isolated campaign against one widow with land Rask wanted. A pattern, a repeating pattern, refined over years, each iteration a little more practiced than the last. "Pollard?" he said, still holding, but barely. His wife told Alderman they've been considering offers. She paused. Alderman said he noticed the pattern when I described what had happened here. He hadn't connected Creedy and Pollard before because the incidents looked different on the surface, because they were designed to look different. Yes. Harlan thought about this on the walk to the house. 3 ranches, 3 separate campaigns, each with different visible incidents: disease, water disputes, feed contamination, physical sabotage, but all pointing in the same direction, all serving the same end. "Alderman's going to be more motivated than I thought," he said. "He's not happy about being kept in the dark," Lenora said. "That's the other thing. He's been in this county 12 years, and he thought he understood what was happening in it. Finding out he'd missed a pattern operating right under his nose that bothered him." visibly. Good. They went inside. The house was warm. Someone had kept the fire going. Probably Dix, who had a quiet habit of attending to things without being asked and never mentioning it afterward. Lenora put water on, and Harlan sat at the table with his bad knee stretched out, because sitting for the first time in 4 hours revealed exactly how much the previous night's fall had cost him. "You're limping worse than this morning," she said. "It's fine. You keep saying that, because it keeps being true eventually." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for statements she found inadequate but wasn't going to press on. "Garland came," he said, changing the direction. She turned. "I know. Cal told me when I came in." She paused. "What did he say?" Harlan told her. When he finished including the message he'd sent back, she was quiet for a moment. "Then, you told him Silver Briar was operating at full capacity, and I have no intention of changing my property situation." "Yes, without asking me first." He looked at her steadily. "Is it not true?" "It's true. But then the message is accurate." She pressed her lips together, not angry, working through it. "You're doing the same thing you did with the feed. Acting first. There wasn't time to wait for you to get back." Garland was there to assess the mood of this ranch. The longer he sat in that office, the more time he had to observe things and draw his own conclusions to bring back to Rask. "I understand why you did it. But I need you to understand that this is my ranch and my situation and my decisions." She said it evenly, without heat. "Even when the decision is the same one you'd make. The act of making it together matters." He held her gaze. "You're right. I should have stalled him and waited for you." She looked mildly surprised by this. "I didn't stall him because I didn't think stalling was the right move in that moment," he said. "I still don't. But I take your point about the principle." She was quiet for a long moment. The water came to a boil. She poured it without breaking the silence, brought 2 cups to the table, and sat across from him. "The message you sent," she said. "Do you think Rask will interpret it correctly? He'll know we're not broken and not considering selling." "Yes. What will he do with that?" "I think," Harlan said, "that we're about to find out." What Rask did with it arrived 3 days later in the form of a letter delivered to Silver Briar by a territorial courier, not a local rider, not someone Lenora knew, but a formal courier with a sealed envelope bearing the letterhead of a Helena law firm. Harlan was in the stable when Lenora came to find him. She had the letter in her hand, and her face had the specific quality it got when she was controlling a reaction rather than having it. She handed him the letter. He read it. It was from Rask's Helena lawyers, not the local man who'd handled previous communication. This was a significant escalation in formality. The letter was 3 pages, dense with legal language, but the core of it was simple. Meridian Holdings, citing the preliminary water rights filing, was now formally asserting a disputed interest in the creek watershed that included Silver Briar's water crossing. Additionally, the letter claimed that Silver Briar's eastern water access had been operating under an informal arrangement that predated proper territorial registration, and that this arrangement was now being formally contested. At the end, almost as a footnote, Mr. Rask remained willing to discuss a purchase of the Silver Briar property that would resolve all outstanding disputes to Mrs. Ashbourne's benefit. Harlan read it twice, then he handed it back. "He moved faster than I thought," he said. "This letter was drafted before he sent Garland," Lenora said. "Before you gave Garland the message. This was already in motion." He looked at her. "You're sure? Helena to Copper Ridge by courier is 5 days minimum in winter." Garland came 3 days ago. She folded the letter with the careful precision of someone who needed to do something with their hands. "He sent this before we gave him any message. He was escalating regardless." Harlan sat with this for a moment. The plan wait for Rask to make an impatient move had been predicated on Rask operating from patience. But this wasn't impatience. This was the next stage of a plan that had been moving on its own timeline the whole time, unaffected by anything Silver Briar did or didn't do. "He's not responding to us," Harlan said slowly. "He never was. He's following his own schedule." "Yes. Which means our approach of making the ranch look stable to confuse his intelligence was probably irrelevant," Lenora said. "He has a legal strategy. It doesn't depend on what we do internally." Harlan looked at the folded letter in her hands. "What does your lawyer in Billings say about the water rights? Did he respond yet?" "I got a letter yesterday. He says our documentation is solid. The 1,878 registration is valid, and the 1,882 review was properly filed." A challenge will take months to work through the territorial process and ultimately should fail on the merits. She paused. But months means spring. Months means the uncertainty period overlaps with contract season, and buyers who hear there's a disputed water situation may pull back from commitments, which damages the ranch financially even if you win legally. Yes, this was the trap inside the trap. The legal challenge didn't need to succeed. It just needed to exist long enough to create doubt. And doubt, in a territory where water was life, was enough to make buyers cautious, to make bankers conservative, to make the ranch's financial picture look shakier than it was. Harlan stood up. His knee was still bad, but he was moving on it better than the day before. "Get your Billings lawyer on a fast horse," he said. "I want a form vomascence to that letter filed with the territorial records within 2 weeks. I already wrote to him this morning." Good, he thought. Alderman. He needs to see this letter. "I'm riding to town tomorrow." And Martin Pollard, Harlan said, the other rancher. If Rask ran the same pattern on him, Pollard's water dispute was dropped, Lenora said, after he'd spent 4 months in legal costs. The company that filed the dispute against Pollard, do you know if it was also Meridian Holdings? Lenora went still. "I don't know," she said. Alderman mentioned the dispute but not the company. "If it was Meridian Holdings," Harlan said, "then we have the same entity filing water challenges against 2 separate ranches in the same county. That's not a coincidence. That's a documented pattern that a territorial judge could use." She looked at him. "If Alderman finds that connection," Harlan said, "and if Pollard is willing to say that what happened to him looked like deliberate pressure, not just a legal dispute, but a coordinated campaign, then this stops being Silver Briar's problem and starts being a territorial matter. Rask has handled territorial matters before. He's handled them one at a time. One ranch, one complaint, one investigation that goes nowhere because there's no visible connection to him." Harlan paused. 3 ranches with the same entity making identical moves that's harder to manage. Lenora was quiet for a long moment. "You want to go to Pollard," she said. "I think you should go to Pollard. Not me, a woman arriving at another rancher's door to discuss a shared problem, is a different thing than a hired man arriving." And Pollard's wife was the one who talked to Alderman. "If there's an opening there, it's through her." Lenora nodded slowly. "I know Mary Pollard. We're not close, but I know her. Would she talk to you?" "If I came honestly about what I was asking and why, yes." "Mary Pollard is not a person who responds well to anything indirect." "Then go directly." She put the letter on the feed chest. "This is becoming something larger than I planned for when I hired a foreman in December." "Yes," he said. "Is that all right with you?" He looked at her. "Is it all right with me? You came here to work horses. Now you're helping me build a legal case against one of the most powerful men in the territory." She said it matter-of-factly, but there was something underneath it that was asking a real question. "I came here because Owen needed somewhere warm," Harlan said. "But I'm still here because Silver Briar is worth being here for. And because what Rask is doing is wrong, and I'm not good at walking away from wrong when I can see it clearly." She held his gaze. "Besides," he said, he laughed at my son. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile, more complicated than that, and gone quickly. "Go rest that knee," she said. He went. Lenora rode to the Pollard Ranch 2 days later. She came back that evening after dark, later than she'd said, and Harlan had been telling himself for 2 hours that he wasn't waiting for her specifically, just that it happened. He was in the main house, doing paperwork when her wagon came through the gate. She came inside with snow in her hair, and the look of someone who'd had a long and useful conversation. "Meridian Holdings," she said, before she'd even taken her coat off. "The same company. Filed a water dispute against Pollard's Eastern Creek access in March of last year. Dropped it in July, when Pollard agreed under financial pressure to allow Meridian Holdings an access easement across his southern property for a road they claimed they needed for a neighboring parcel." Harlan straightened. An easement, a right-of-way across his land. Pollard agreed because ending the water dispute saved him more in legal costs than the easement seemed to cost. She unwound her scarf. "But the easement road runs along the fence line between Pollard's property and Silver Briar's eastern boundary." Harlan looked at her. "If you stand on that easement road at the right point," Lenora said, "you have an unobstructed view of Silver Briar's water crossing." The room was very quiet. "He used the Pollard dispute to get eyes on our property," Harlan said. "He used the Pollard dispute to get legal access to a road that nobody could tell him to leave." She sat down. "He watched us for 8 months before he moved. Mary Pollard, knows all of this. She's known for months that something was wrong with how the dispute resolved, but Pollard wanted it over, and she didn't have enough to point to. Lenora looked at Harlan directly. She wants to talk to Alderman. And Pollard? Martin Pollard is a proud man, and he's angry that he didn't see it when it was happening. But he's also scared. She paused. His wife is less scared. Would Pollard testify? Formally, if it came to that. Mary says she can bring him around. But she needs something to show him something that makes it clear that talking to Alderman puts Rask at risk, not just irritates him. The Creedy property, Harlan said. Lenora looked at him. Creedy sold to Meridian Holdings 8 months ago, he said. If we can get the terms of that sale, if there's evidence that Creedy was pressured, rather than making a willing business decision, that's the third instance. Creedy left the territory after the sale. His family is in Oregon now. Could your lawyer find him? She thought. Possibly, if he's willing to be found. She leaned back in the chair. Harlan, this is months of work, legal research, witnesses, documentation. Alderman can help, but he's a county sheriff, not a territorial prosecutor. I know. And while we're building this, Rask's water challenge is moving through the territorial process and affecting our spring contracts. I know that too. So how do we— She stopped, started again. How do we manage the long build while keeping the ranch from bleeding out in the short term? He'd been thinking about this since the letter arrived. We need to make a public move, he said. Something that shifts the story that's being told about Silver Briar. What do you mean? Right now, the story Rask is writing is Silver Briar is troubled. Water dispute pending. New and uncertain management. Widow who might be pressured. That's the story buyers are hearing. He paused. We write a different story. How? The spring training contracts, he said. The 4 ranchers who have agreements with Silver Briar for working horse preparation, are any of them likely to pull back because of the water dispute? Lenora thought. Bennett might. He's cautious and he's heard the rumors. Then we go to Bennett first. Not to reassure him, to offer him something better than what we agreed to. A guaranteed delivery date on 3 horses instead of 2, at the same price. We're already stretched on the training schedule. I know. We'll make it work. He held her gaze. If Bennett renews and upgrades his contract, and if that gets back to the other buyers, the story changes. Silver Briar is so confident in its operation that it's offering better terms in the middle of a dispute. She looked at him for a long time. That's a gamble. Yes, if we can't deliver, we'll deliver. You can't guarantee that. No, he said, I can't. But I've looked at what we have, what the horses can do, and how the training schedule sits. We can deliver 3 horses for Bennett by the end of April if we start now. She was quiet. The alternative, he said, is we hold still and let Rask's story be the only one people hear. And by spring, it won't matter if we win the legal case, because the buyers will have gone elsewhere. Lenora pressed her fingertips together on the table. All right, she said. Bennett first. Good. And Alderman? I want to tell him about the easement road. That's not a legal technicality, that's evidence of deliberate surveillance. And Alderman can understand what that means, even if a territorial court takes time to process it. She nodded. Then when did you learn to think like this? The question caught him slightly off guard. Like what? Like several moves ahead. Simultaneously. You're managing the horses, the training schedule, the legal situation. Alderman, the Pollards, the story buyers are hearing. She paused. You're holding a lot of different things at once. He thought about how to answer that honestly. When you've got 1 child and 51 cents, he said, you get good at knowing which fire to put out in what order. She looked at him. He hadn't meant it to land the way it did. I didn't say that to be— He started. I know why you said it, she said quietly. It wasn't a complaint. They sat there for a moment, with the fire going and the snow outside and the ranch quiet around them. And it was the kind of quiet that had changed its character in the past 3 months, not the quiet of 2 people who didn't know each other, but the quiet of 2 people who knew each other well enough to not need to fill every space with words. Go home, Lenora said. Owen'll be awake. He's usually asleep, but he's not asleep. I heard him moving around up there when I came past the cottage window. Harlan stood. He's supposed to be asleep by 8. He's 9. They don't sleep when you tell them to. They sleep when they're tired. She said it with the specific certainty of someone who had observed this fact even without children of her own. He went back to the cottage and found Owen at the table with the almanac and a candle stub and the expression of someone who had not been awake when his father wasn't supposed to know he was awake. That candle's almost done, Harlan said. I know. I was just finishing. Finishing what? Owen showed him the almanac page. He'd been reading about creek hydrology, how creek flow rates related to seasonal snowmelt. I was trying to understand, he said, about the water rights thing. If the creek comes from snowmelt, does the person whose land is higher up control the water? Harlan sat down across from him. It's more complicated than that. That's what I figured. The almanac doesn't explain it very well. Prior appropriation doctrine, Harlan said. In this territory, water rights go to whoever registered them first and can show continued beneficial use. It's not about whose land the water crosses. Owen thought about this. So Mrs. Ashbourne registered first in 1878, and the company that's claiming the dispute registered nothing. They're claiming the original registration was flawed. Is it flawed? No. Then they'll lose, eventually. But eventually takes time. Owen sat with this. The candle guttered, and he cupped his hand around it instinctively, which kept it lit for another few seconds before it went out. He didn't seem upset about it. Is she going to be okay? Owen said. In the dark. Mrs. Ashbourne? Yes, Harlan said. How do you know? Because she's smart and she's not going to give up, and because we're not going to let her lose something she spent 10 years building. He paused. We're going to go to bed now. Okay. Owen got up without argument, which told Harlan more about how tired the boy actually was than any earlier protest would have. He went up the ladder. At the top he said, Pa, what? You said we, like you and me both. I meant Silver Briar generally. No, you didn't, Owen said, and pulled the ladder up behind him. Harlan sat in the dark for a while. Alderman came to Silver Briar 4 days after Lenora's return from the Pollards. He came without announcement, which Lenora said was how he operated when a visit was about business, rather than the social supper arrangement, arriving at a working hour without ceremony, so the meeting could be about what it was about. He was a big man, somewhere past 55, with a methodical quality to his movements that Harlan read as the accumulation of years of situations that rewarded thinking before acting. He shook Lenora's hand at the door and nodded at Harlan when introduced and said, simply, I've heard things about you. And Harlan said, probably some of them are accurate, and Alderman made a sound that might have been a laugh. They sat in the front room. Alderman put a folder on the table. Meridian Holdings, he said. I did some checking. Lenora leaned forward slightly. It's registered in Helena. 3 partners of record. 2 of them are investment names. I can't tie them to anything specific yet. The 3rd is a man named Casper Dunn. He looked at Lenora. Do you know that name? No, he's an attorney. Not Rask's regular lawyer, different man. But he's handled 3 property transactions in this territory in the past 4 years, all of them in situations where a ranch was sold under financial pressure. He paused. One of those transactions was the Creedy property. Harlan said, so Dunn is the legal face of whatever Rask is running through Meridian Holdings. That's my read, yes. I can't prove Rask owns or controls Meridian Holdings. The structure is designed to prevent that. Alderman opened the folder. But I can show that Dunn has represented both Meridian Holdings and Rask's personal interests in other matters. That's a connection. Is it enough for a territorial prosecutor? It's a start. Alderman looked at both of them, Mrs. Ashbourne told me about the easement road on Pollard's property. I wrote it yesterday. Harlan said, and from the highest point on that road, you have a direct sightline to Silver Briar's north stable, your main paddock, and about 200 yards of your property's eastern boundary. He closed the folder. I've been sheriff of this county for 12 years. Easement roads are usually just roads. This one has a specific and useful view that has nothing to do with road access. Pollard's willing to talk, Lenora said. His wife said so. Pollard himself is working up to it, Lenora said. He'll get there. Alderman looked at Harlan. Your account of what happened during the storm. The man who went over the fence. Can you describe him? Fast. Light build. Moved like someone who'd planned the route in advance. He was over the far fence before I was halfway across the paddock. Consistent with Briggs. Fletcher's description of the man who came in with forged papers matches Briggs exactly. Fletcher will say so officially? Yes, Harlan said. I've already spoken to him. Alderman was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man assembling something, turning pieces in his hands, and seeing how they fit. I spoke to Edmund Rask yesterday, he said. The room went still. I told him I was making some general inquiries about incidents in the county, didn't specify Silver Briar. Asked if he'd had any trouble at his operation. Alderman paused. He was very smooth, very cooperative. Offered to help however he could. And then he reached into the folder again and produced a single sheet. He sent me this an hour after I left. He handed it to Lenora. It was a letter from Rask, formal and polite, expressing his deep concern about the troubled situation at Silver Briar Ranch, noting that the recent incidents there, the sick horses, the management difficulties, the pending water dispute suggested that Mrs. Ashbourne might benefit from assistance in managing a property that had perhaps grown beyond her capacity to handle alone. He offered again to discuss a purchase arrangement and suggested that resolving the situation through a sale would spare Mrs. Ashbourne considerable ongoing difficulty. He'd sent it 1 hour after Alderman visited him. "He knew you'd spoken to me," Lenora said. "Yes, which means someone told him. Within an hour of my leaving his property." Alderman took the letter back. "Which means I have someone in this county, possibly in this town, who reports to Rask. And I don't know who it is." The fire cracked. Outside, wind moved through the cottonwoods in a low sound that had become familiar enough over the past months to be almost like silence. "He's not worried about your inquiry," Harlan said to Alderman. "No, he's not. He thinks he's ahead of it. He's been ahead of things like this before," Alderman said, without apology. "I want to be honest with you about that. I've been in this county while he's operated, and I didn't see it until Mrs. Ashbourne brought it to me. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with." "It's not your failure," Lenora said. "He's very good at this." "Maybe, but I'm going to be better at it going forward." Alderman stood. "I'm going to Billings next week. There's a territorial prosecutor. I know, a careful man, not political, not connected to the land interests here. If I can put what I have in front of him, he may be able to move on Meridian holdings at the territorial level." "Rask will know when you go to Billings," Harlan said. "Probably within a day of my arriving." Alderman picked up his hat. "I'm counting on it." Harlan looked at him. "If Rask knows I've gone to a territorial prosecutor," Alderman said, "he has a choice. He can pull back or he can escalate. If he pulls back, the water challenge and the Meridian holdings structure may unravel on their own when nobody's actively maintaining them. If he escalates," Alderman put his hat on, "then he makes a mistake." It was, Harlan realized, the same logic he'd been working from. Push him past patience, and he makes a move that can't be pulled back. He looked at Alderman with a slightly different assessment than he'd started the conversation with. "You've done this before," Harlan said, "not with Rask, but with men like him." Alderman nodded at Lenora, then at Harlan. "Keep the horses running. Run your contracts on schedule. Don't give him any visible distress to point to." "We're planning to upgrade Bennett's contract," Lenora said. Alderman raised an eyebrow. "In the middle of this." "Because of this," Harlan said. Alderman looked at him for a moment with the assessing stillness of a man recalibrating. "Then good," he said, and left. Rask escalated. Harlan had expected it. He'd told Lenora to expect it. He'd spent the week after Alderman's visit making sure the ranch was prepared for something he couldn't fully predict. He'd added a night watch rotation, Cal and Dix and Fletcher alternating, one person awake and moving between the stable, the feed room, and the water crossing gate every 3 hours through the night. He didn't tell them exactly why. He told them there'd been incidents, and he wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. Cal understood. The others accepted it. When it came, it wasn't fire. It wasn't the stable. It was the horses themselves. On a Thursday morning in early March, 4 of Silver Briar's registered breeding animals, 3 mares, and the valuable stallion that had come with the mare from Rask's previous sale were found at the county livestock office with registration papers claiming they were the property of Meridian Holdings, seized pending resolution of a disputed breeding contract that the company claimed Silver Briar had defaulted on. Harlan heard about it from Fletcher, who came running from the gate at 7 in the morning with the look of someone who'd received information faster than his legs could carry it. "Men at the gate," Fletcher said, breathless. 2 of them and a county livestock officer. "They've got papers." Harlan was already moving. The livestock officer was a man named Pryor. Harlan didn't know him, but had seen him in Copper Ridge once, and he was uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who has been handed a task he doesn't fully believe in, but is required to carry out anyway. He had documents. He read them when Harlan asked him to. The documents claimed that Silver Briar had entered a breeding contract with Meridian Holdings in 1884 before Harlan's arrival, before the current situation, and had defaulted on delivery of 4 animals. Meridian Holdings was exercising its contractual right to reclaim the animals pending legal resolution. "There is no contract," Lenora said. She had come out behind Harlan. Her voice was completely level. Silver Briar has never entered a contract with Meridian Holdings or any party of that name. Ma'am, I have documentation. I'd like to see it. He handed her the papers. She read them. Her face didn't change. She handed them to Harlan. He read them. The contract was dated September 1884. It bore a signature that looked, at first glance, like Lenora's, but something was wrong with the formation of the letters. And the year was during a period when Silver Briar's previous foreman had been managing most of the ranch's paperwork, while Lenora dealt with a property boundary matter that had occupied her attention for several months. Forged, but professionally forged, not obviously, not clumsily. I'd like you to compare that signature to a current document, Harlan said to Pryor. He looked at Lenora. The Bennett contract renewal, do you have a copy in the house? She understood immediately. I'll get it. She went to the house. Pryor and the two men with him, both of them, Harlan didn't recognize, not local hands, hired specifically for this task, waited at the gate. While Lenora was in the house, Harlan looked at the two hired men. One of them was Briggs. He recognized the description: thin, light hair, and the bay with the split ear was tied at the gate rail. Harlan looked at Briggs. Briggs looked back at him with the watchful stillness of a man who was being paid to be somewhere and had committed to it for the day. Harlan turned back to Pryor. Lenora came back with the Bennett contract signed that week, fresh ink, the signature clear. Pryor looked at both documents. He was quiet for a while. The contract signature is different, Harlan said. Not accusatory, factual. Look at the way she forms the capital A in Ashbourne. The one on the Meridian Holdings document curves inward. The way she actually signs it, it curves outward. Pryor looked. I'd like to formally report a forged document, Harlan said, still factually, still without heat. And I'd like you to note in your record that the individual named Briggs, who is standing at that gate and can be identified by Fletcher Crane, an employee of this ranch, was the same individual who entered Silver Briar's property in January using forged supplier paperwork and is believed to have contaminated the ranch's feed supply. Briggs went absolutely still. Pryor looked up from the documents. I'm not accusing your officer of anything, Harlan said. I understand you were given papers and told to do a job. But I'd like you to see clearly what's happening here. Before you make a decision, you can't walk back. Pryor looked at the documents. He looked at Briggs. He looked at Harlan. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm not taking these animals today. There's a signature discrepancy that needs to be reviewed before any livestock removal. Briggs said, Our instructions were to— I know what your instructions were, Pryor said, with a sharpness that surprised everyone, including, apparently, Pryor himself. My instructions are to exercise proper process. I'm exercising it. He handed the Meridian Holdings contract back to Harlan. I'll be filing a report on the signature question. I'd suggest you do the same, Mrs. Ashbourne, through your legal representation. He left. The two hired men left with him. Briggs at the gate looked back once before he went. Harlan held his eyes. Briggs looked away first. After the gate closed, Lenora stood beside Harlan, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He overreached, Harlan said. Yes, a forged contract is a criminal matter. The water rights challenge is civil. Contaminated feed arguable. Forged ownership documents is different. Pryor's going to report it. He has to. He examined both signatures in front of witnesses. Harlan turned to look at her. And Briggs was here identified. Pryor saw him. Lenora exhaled slowly. He panicked. He thought Alderman's trip to Billings meant the legal process was moving against him. So he tried to move the animals before any court order could complicate it. Harlan paused. He moved before he was ready because he thought we were moving. Alderman planned for this. Alderman planned on Rask escalating. He didn't know what form it would take. Harlan looked at the gate. Write to Alderman today. Send Fletcher fast horse. Don't wait for the regular mail. Already thinking it, she said. They stood in the thin March light in the mud of the yard. And behind them, Silver Briar's 43 horses were going about their morning, and the stable hands were moving through the routine that had become its own reliable rhythm over the past 3 months. And the ranch looked exactly like what Harlan had been working to make it look like: functional, untroubled, steady. But the gate where Briggs had stood a few minutes ago still held the shape of what had almost happened. 4 horses. Gone. The breeding program gutted in one morning by documents that looked real enough at a distance. If Lenora hadn't come out with the Bennett contract, if Pryor had been less careful or less honest, If Harlan hadn't remembered the description of Briggs and had the presence of mind to name him in front of witnesses while Pryor was still standing there. 4 horses. He thought about Rask in his comfortable house, being informed by his informant in Copperidge that the livestock officer had come back empty, that Briggs had been identified by name, that the forged contract had been examined and found wanting by the officer himself. He thought about what that information would feel like, landing on a patient man at the end of his patience. "Get inside," he said. "Write to Alderman, and then write to your Billings lawyer and tell him about the forged contract." "What are you going to do?" Harlan looked at the gate. "I'm going to make sure every animal on this property is accounted for and secured," he said. "And then I'm going to wait." She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment longer. Somewhere across the ridge, Edmund Rask's plan was fracturing in the specific way that plans fracture when the thing they depend on an enemy who doesn't push back. A target who absorbs pressure without responding turns out not to be true. It didn't feel like winning. Winning would come later, or it wouldn't. Right now, it just felt like the morning after a very long night, with the horses needing feeding, and the knee still aching, and a boy at school 3 miles away, who deserved to come home to a ranch that was still standing. Harlan went to feed the horses. Briggs talked on a Tuesday. Harlan didn't hear it directly. He heard it the way things traveled in a territory like this, which was through Alderman, who rode out to Silver Briar 4 days after the livestock office incident, with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying news long enough that he's ready to put it down. They sat in Lenora's front room, the 3 of them, with coffee that nobody was drinking. Pryor filed his report the same afternoon, Alderman said. The signature discrepancy, Briggs identified by name, the forged supplier papers from January. I had it in hand by Friday. He paused. I went to see Briggs Saturday morning. And, Lenora said, he'd already spoken to a lawyer, which told me he was scared. Alderman set his cup on the table. I told him what he was looking at: forged documents, deliberate contamination of livestock feed, trespass with intent, criminal charges, not civil, a territorial court, not a county hearing. He looked at Harlan. He asked how much it would help him to tell me who gave the instructions. What did you tell him? I told him it would help him considerably. Alderman opened the folder he'd brought. He gave me 3 things. First, a written account of every task Rask gave him at Silver Briar, the feed contamination in January, the Northgate incident in February, the forged breeding contract. Second, the name of the man inside Copper Ridge who was passing information to Rask about Alderman's movements. He paused. It was Garland, the feed merchant. Lenora exhaled slowly. And third, Alderman said, Briggs gave me a name in Helena. A man inside the Territorial Land Records office who had been altering filing dates on Meridian Holdings documents, making them appear older than they were, giving the company a longer history of legitimate land interest than it actually had. The room was quiet. Harlan looked at Lenora. She was sitting with her hands very still in her lap, and her face carrying the expression of someone absorbing something that was larger than what they'd been expecting. Not disbelief. More like the particular vertigo that comes when a thing you suspected turns out to be even more organized than you feared. He had someone inside the Territorial Records office, she said. For at least 2 years, Alderman said, which explains why Creedy's sale looked clean on paper when I reviewed it. The dates had been adjusted to make Meridian Holdings appear to have a prior interest in the property that they didn't actually have. Can you prove the alterations? Harlan said. The territorial prosecutor in Billings has had 2 men in the land records office since Wednesday, Alderman said, going through every Meridian Holdings filing document by document. He closed the folder. They found inconsistencies in the ink aging on 4 separate documents. That's a forensic matter, not just my word against Rask's. Rask will say he didn't know what Meridian Holdings was doing, Lenora said. He'll say Dunn acted independently. He'll try that argument, yes. Alderman picked up his coffee cup and finally drank some of it. But Briggs's testimony connects Rask personally to the Silver Briar incidents. Not Dunn, not Meridian Holdings. Rask directly, in conversation, giving instructions. He set the cup down. That's harder to walk away from. Harlan thought about Edmund Rask in the Copper Ridge supper house, pulling his gloves off finger by finger. The particular ease of a man who has never had reason to believe that consequences applied to him the way they applied to other people. When, Harlan said. The territorial prosecutor wants another week to complete the document review. Then he'll file. Alderman looked at both of them. Rask is going to know before the filing. He may know already whatever pipeline he had through Garland is closed now, but he has other sources. Will he run? Lenora said. Men like Rask don't run, Alderman said. They lawyer up and they fight. But they fight in courts, and courts have rules that his kind of operation doesn't do well under. He stood. The water rights challenge will be withdrawn as part of the broader filing. The Meridian Holdings Company will be dissolved by the court. The Creedy sale is under review. I don't know yet if that can be unwound, but Creedy's family has been contacted. Lenora was quiet. It's not a clean ending, Alderman said. I want to be honest about that. Rask has resources. He'll fight. It'll take time. But he's not going to be able to operate the same way, Harlan said. No, he's not. Alderman picked up his hat. Whatever he thought he was building out here, it's over. He left. The quiet that followed was the kind that needed a few minutes to settle before it became real. Lenora sat where she was for a while after Alderman's wagon left the gate. Harlan didn't try to fill the space. He'd learned, over the past 3 months, that she processed things in the same order as him: first the practical implications, then the emotional weight, then whatever synthesis came out the other side, and that trying to rush any stage was not useful. Finally, she said, Garland. Yes. He was in that supper house the night you arrived. I remember seeing him at the back table. She paused. He watched the whole thing and reported back to Rask about a new man at Silver Briar with 51 cents and a child, Harlan said. That's probably when Rask decided I was the right person to use as a scapegoat if things got messy. A drifter with no connections and no leverage. She looked at him. He underestimated you badly. He underestimated you, Harlan said. I was the part he didn't anticipate. She considered this. Then, quietly, we make a good problem for people like him. Something about the way she said we casually, without loading it, settled into him like weight finding its right place. We do, he said. Spring came to Silver Briar the way it always came to Montana, grudgingly, with setbacks. 3 warm days followed by a late freeze that killed the first growth of new grass and required 2 days of extra feeding while the horses stood in wet paddocks, looking reproachful about the whole situation. But it came. The Bennett contract was completed on schedule. 3 horses delivered to Bennett's operation on the 28th of April, which was 4 days ahead of the guaranteed date. Bennett came himself to collect them and stood at the paddock fence watching his animals move and said, without preamble, these are calmer than anything I've gotten from a training operation in 10 years. They were scared when they came in, Harlan said. They're not scared anymore. Bennett looked at him. How'd you do it? Mostly. Harlan paused. You stop trying to force the thing and start trying to understand what they're afraid of. Once you know that, you can address it directly. Bennett looked at the horses for another moment. I'm sending you 4 animals next season. We can accommodate that. And I'm going to tell Whitfield to call you. Whitfield was the largest horse buyer in the Northern Territory. Harlan kept his expression neutral. We'd be glad to hear from him. Bennett left with his horses. Harlan stood at the fence for a while. When he turned, Owen was behind him. The boy had been helping with the morning feeding and had the smell of hay and horse on him that Harlan associated, now, with things being generally right. Bennett seemed happy, Owen said. He was. Did you know those horses would turn out that good? Harlan thought about this honestly. I hoped. I didn't know. Isn't that a risky thing? Promising something you're not sure you can deliver? Yes, Harlan said. But the alternative was not promising anything and letting the story about Silver Briar be whatever Rask was telling. Sometimes you have to move on hope because waiting for certainty costs you more than the risk. Owen considered this with the seriousness he applied to everything. That's kind of a hard way to live. It is, Harlan said. But the other way is harder. They walked back toward the stable together, and the spring light was on the pasture and the horses were in it, and the ranch had the look of a thing that had been through difficulty and was still standing, which is a different look than a thing that has never been tested, less polished, more certain. The territorial prosecutor filed charges against Edmund Rask in the 3rd week of May, not through Alderman, through the Helena office, directly, which meant it was a territorial matter, not a county one, and carried the weight of a government that was larger than any one man's local influence. The charges included fraud, conspiracy to commit property theft, and deliberate interference with another party's water rights through falsified documents. Casper Dunn, the attorney behind Meridian Holdings, was charged separately and immediately began cooperating with the prosecutor's office in the way that men cooperate when cooperation is the only lever they have left. Harlan heard about it from Alderman, who rode out again with the same expression as before but lighter this time. The expression of a man who has put something to rest that was bothering him. Rask's lawyers filed an immediate response, Alderman said. Standard procedure. It'll take a year, maybe more, to work through. But the water challenge is dropped? Lenora said. Withdrawn as of this morning. Meridian Holdings is dissolved by court order. The Land Records Office alterations are part of the criminal case. He paused. The Creedy family has been contacted about the sale. It may be reversible, it may not. But they know what happened. Lenora nodded. Briggs took a reduced charge in exchange for testimony, Alderman said. Garland is cooperating. The man in the records office has already pled. He looked at Harlan. It unraveled fast once it started. These things usually do. The architecture looks solid until one piece moves, and then the whole thing comes apart from the inside. Rask built it on other people's fear, Harlan said. Fear holds until it doesn't. Alderman stood. The men in Copper Ridge who laughed at you in December, he said, not quite looking at Harlan. Word travels. They know what you did here. Harlan said nothing. I'm not saying you should care, Alderman said. I'm saying the word travels. He left. Lenora found Harlan that evening at the north fence line, checking posts, the same work he'd been doing the day. She came back from Copper Ridge with Alderman's visit and changed the shape of everything. She stood beside him at the fence and looked out at the pasture where the breeding mares were moving in the long spring light. I want to change the foreman arrangement, she said. He looked at her. I've been thinking about it since the Bennett contract, she said. About what you did, not just the horses, not just the legal situation, the whole of it. The way you held this ranch together when it was being pulled apart. She paused. A foreman's wage is not the right accounting for what that is. Lenora, I want you to have a partnership stake in Silver Briar, she said. A formal one, not a wage, an actual ownership position. A third of the operation, in your name legally. He turned to look at her fully. Her expression was the same one she'd had in the supper house in December, when she'd walked across that crowded room, decided, direct, not waiting for him to make it easier. That's too much, he said. It's the right amount. I came here with nothing. You came here and you stayed, she said. When you could have left before I suffered for it, you stayed. When the horses got sick, you stayed in that stable all night on a cracked bucket. When someone went over the fence in a blizzard, you went after him. She paused. You built something here. Not just repaired what was broken. Built something. The training methods, the way the hands work now, the reputation that got Bennett here and will get Whitfield here by fall. That came from you. He looked at the pasture. It also came from you, he said quietly. The resources, the contacts, the 10 years of ground you'd already made, which is why it's a partnership and not a gift. She held his gaze. I'm not making you wealthy out of charity, Harlan. I'm making you my partner, because that's what you already are. The paper just needs to catch up to the reality. He was quiet for a long time. The mares moved through the evening light. One of them, the anxious one, the one who'd pressed her head against the stall wall in January, was grazing calmly near the fence line, with her shoulder against the gelding he'd paired her with. And she was nothing like the animal she'd been 4 months ago. She was still herself, still watchful. But the fear had gone out of her the way fear goes when the thing causing it is, finally, actually gone. All right, Harlan said. Lenora exhaled. There's something else, she said. And then she stopped, which was unlike her. She was not generally a person who stopped in the middle of things. He waited. I know what this has been, she said. Working together. Every morning, every problem, the way Owen talks to me now, like I know what it's been. She looked at the pasture instead of him. I'm not asking you to declare anything. I'm not making this into a scene. I'm just saying that I know what I feel about it, and I thought you should know that I know. The fence rail was rough under his hands. He thought about his wife. He thought about the particular specific weight of that loss, which had not left him and probably never would entirely, and which had its own shelf in him that nothing and nobody would displace. He thought about Owen saying, you said, we like you and me, both in the dark of the cottage loft. I know what it's been too, he said. She nodded once, like that was enough for now, because it was. They stood at the fence until the light went, and neither of them needed to say anything else about it, and the horses moved in the dusk, and Silver Briar held its ground under the spring sky. Summer came in fully by late June, and the ranch moved into the pace that summer ranches have: longer days, heavier work, the particular satisfaction of seeing the season's preparations become the season itself. The 3 mares and the stallion that Rask had tried to claim through the forged contract remained at Silver Briar. The court had issued a protective order on all Silver Briar livestock the week after the charges were filed, and the Meridian Holdings claim had been formally dismissed as fraudulent. The stallion, whom the hands called Caesar, because he had the arrogance of someone who'd been told he was exceptional, turned out to be exactly as good as his bloodline suggested. Harlan worked with him through April and May with the same patient method he used on everything: no force, no intimidation, just consistent presence and the slow building of an understanding between horse and handler that replaced fear with something more reliable. By June, Caesar was the finest working stallion in the operation. Ranchers came to see him. Word spread. 2 buyers from as far as Billings made inquiries about breeding rights for the following season. Harlan handled these conversations at the fence with the same directness he handled everything: no inflation, no promises he couldn't keep, just straight accounting of what the horse was and what he could do. Owen watched one of these conversations from a safe distance and afterwards said, "You didn't tell them he was the best stallion in the territory." "He might be. I don't know every stallion in the territory." Bennett's man said so. Bennett's man has been to maybe 40 operations. The territory is bigger than 40 operations. Harlan looked at him. Don't oversell a thing. The thing should do its own talking. Owen considered this. Is that a general rule or just for horses? Both, Harlan said. Most good rules are both. In August, Harlan and Lenora signed the partnership documents in the county office in Copper Ridge. It was a Tuesday. A clerk named Pruitt, not Owen's schoolmaster, a different Pruitt, which was a coincidence. Harlan found mildly amusing, witnessed the signatures, and stamped the papers with the thoroughness of a man who took the responsibility of stamp application seriously. Lenora signed first, then Harlan, then Pruitt stamped it twice, which seemed like once more than necessary but felt oddly right anyway. They walked out into the August sun of Copper Ridge's Main Street, and Lenora squinted against the light, and Harlan stood there holding his copy of the partnership document that said, in the formal language of territorial law, that this penniless cowboy was now the co-owner of one of the most respected horse operations in the territory. He didn't feel different, exactly. He felt like the paper had caught up to the reality, the way Lenora had said it would. Supper, she said. He looked down the street at Jessup's supper house. Yes, they went in. The room was much the same as it had been in December, the same tables, the same low ceiling, the same smell of beef stew and bread and tallow candles. Some of the faces were the same, too. Harlan recognized 2 of the men who had laughed at his patched coat on that December evening. One of them looked up when Harlan and Lenora walked in. He went very still. Harlan didn't look at him long. He looked at the table near the window, the best table, the one that got the finest light, and he and Lenora sat there, because there was no reason not to. And 2 menus were placed in front of them without hesitation by Greer, who had been behind the counter for 11 years and whose expression, when he recognized Harlan, was exactly what a person's expression looks like when a circle closes. The stew's good tonight, Greer said. We'll have 2, Lenora said. Owen wasn't there, he was at school, because it was a Tuesday, and school didn't stop for legal paperwork, but his absence made Harlan think about him, which was the same as a presence. He thought about the boy counting to himself in December, watching the steaming plates across the room, saying, "I'm not that hungry," when he absolutely was. Climbing the ladder to the Silver Briar loft on the first night and being asleep in minutes because for the first time in months, the cold wasn't coming through the walls. The stew arrived. Lenora looked at him across the table. "You're thinking about Owen." "Yes, he's fine." "I know he's fine." "Then what are you thinking specifically?" He looked at his plate. "I'm thinking about December, in this room." The look on his face when he told me he wasn't hungry. She was quiet. "He's a different kid now," Harlan said. "Not changed, same kid. But the weight's different. He worries less about tomorrow." "Children should worry less about tomorrow," Lenora said. "I know. He worried about it because I couldn't protect him from having to." He paused. "That's the thing I couldn't fix by working harder. I couldn't fix it until we found somewhere that was stable enough for him to just be 9. Lenora looked at him steadily. "He's 11 now, I know." Time moved. It did. "That's not nothing," she said. 2 years of him getting to be a kid. That came from you. It came from you offering us supper. You would have found somewhere," she said. "You'd have kept going until you did, maybe." He picked up his spoon. "I'd like to think so." They ate. The man at the other table, the one who'd laughed at the patched coat, had looked at his plate the entire time. Harlan and Lenora were talking, with the concentrated focus of someone making himself very small, in a room he wished he'd left earlier. His companion said something low to him. He shook his head slightly. Harlan didn't confront them. He didn't look at them again. Whatever had needed to be resolved between Harlan Vey and the kind of man who laughed at a father, counting coins in front of his hungry child, had been resolved, and it hadn't been resolved in Jessup's supper house. It had been resolved in a frozen stable in January, and at a north fence in a blizzard, and in a county livestock office, with a forged contract, and a man named Briggs who went still when Harlan said his name out loud. You didn't get even with men like that by confronting them. You got even by becoming undeniable. They married in September, not a large ceremony. Lenora had done a large ceremony the first time, and found it suited other people's expectations more than her own. And Harlan had never been comfortable with events designed primarily for looking at, so they kept it small aldermen, who turned out to be ordained for reasons he declined to elaborate on. Cal and Dix and Fletcher, Owen and Mary Pollard, who had developed a friendship with Lenora over the summer that neither of them seemed to find surprising. Owen, at 11, was composed throughout, which was how he handled things that mattered. He shook hands with aldermen. He stood beside his father during the brief exchange of words and held himself with the specific dignity of a child who understood the weight of what was happening. Afterward, when the others had moved toward the table and the food, Owen stayed beside Harlan for a moment. "You okay?" Harlan said. "Yeah." Owen looked at Lenora, who was talking to Mary Pollard with the particular animation she had when she was engaged with someone she found genuinely interesting. "She makes you different." "What do you mean?" "You laugh more than you used to." He paused. "You worried all the time before. Even when you didn't say anything, I could feel it. Like the worrying was always there behind everything." Owen looked up at his father. "It's not gone, I know that. But it's quieter now." Harlan looked at his son. "She does that," Owen said. "And you do it for her too, I can tell, can you?" "Yeah." He straightened up. "I like it here. Good." "I want to stay. We're staying, I know," Owen said. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He went to get food. What Harlan understood, in the years that followed, and there were good years, hard years, years where the ranch tested every piece of knowledge and patience and judgment he had, was that the night in Jessup's supper house had been about more than what it appeared to be about. He'd walked in as a man the world had decided was worth nothing. He'd counted coins in his palm and come up short, and been laughed at for it by a man who had never once in his life been short, and he'd been prepared to leave hungry rather than beg, because pride was the only currency he had left. What Lenora had done walking across that room was not rescue him. That was the misunderstanding, the easy reading of the story. She hadn't rescued him. She'd given him room to stand up in. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. A man who is rescued is grateful. A man who is given room to stand up in becomes something more complicated and more useful, becomes someone who stands up in that room and stays standing, and eventually becomes the kind of person other people lean against when the wind gets bad. He'd spent the rest of his life, more or less, trying to be worth the room she'd given him. She spent the rest of hers, more or less, making sure he understood he already was. Neither of them managed it perfectly, but the horses were good. And Owen grew up knowing what it felt like to live inside something solid. And Silver Briar stood on the land it had always stood on, with the water still running through the crossing that nobody had managed to take from it. And the breeding program that Harlan and Lenora built together produced horses known across 3 territories for being calm and dependable and unafraid, which was, in the end, not a small thing to make in the world. Not a small thing at all.